The cemetery on KL-7 had no visitors anymore. It sat at the southern edge of what had once been designated Colony Square, a flat stretch of engineered permafrost that the first settlers had broken with thermal drills and seeded with a hardy hybrid grass imported from Earth's Siberian experiments. The grass was dead now. It had died in the first month after evacuation, when the atmospheric processors shut down in KL-7 natural climate. A brittle mean cold that averaged -40°C at the equator crawled back in like an animal reclaiming a stolen den. The ground beneath the dead grass had frozen solid again, cracking in geometric patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like the planet was drawing lines around the things humans had built and saying these are yours and they are finished. The cemetery itself was small. 43 markers, each one a rectangle of local stone cut rough and set into the earth by hands that were not masons' hands, maintenance workers mostly, and a schoolteacher who had once done a semester of sculpture before switching to education. The stones were uneven in height and spacing, leaning at slightly different angles like teeth in a mouth that had never been straightened. Some had names carved into them. Some had only numbers. Two of them, at the very back row, had nothing at all, smooth blank faces turned toward the sky, marking graves where the bodies had been too damaged to identify, where even dental records had been useless because there had been no teeth left to compare. KL-7 had never been a desirable posting. It sat in a quiet arm of THE Chinese letter frontier, far from the trade routes that made stations like Omega-9 wealthy and well-stocked. The planet had one resource worth mentioning, a deep veins of rare earth minerals that the corporate extraction division had flagged for future development, but had never gotten around to exploiting because the logistics costs outweighed the projected profits. The colony that had been established there was not a corporate venture. It was a resettlement program, one of dozens that the Interplanetary Aid Coalition ran for displaced populations, refugees from border conflicts, survivors of colony failures on more hostile worlds, people who had nowhere else to go and who accepted KL-7 because KL-7 was what was available. 612 people had lived there at its peak. They had a community center with a warped basketball court. They had a school that taught up to the equivalent of 8th grade, after which students who wanted to continue their education could apply for scholarship slots at orbital academies. They had a medical clinic staffed by one full-time doctor and 2 nurses who had been trained in emergency field medicine, and who handled everything from broken bones to appendectomies with the calm competence of people who had learned that panicking was a luxury they could not afford. They had a bar called The Drift, run by a woman named Okonkwo who had been a chemical engineer on Titan before the resettlement, and who brewed something she called pale ale, but that was, by any objective standard, closer to fermented grain water with ambition. Nobody cared. The Drift was warm, and it was dry, and on Friday nights Okonkwo played music from a scratch playlist that hadn't been updated in 6 years, and people sat at mismatched tables and talked about things that did not matter. And for a few hours the cold and the isolation and the sense of being forgotten by the rest of the galaxy felt like things that could be endured rather than things that were slowly killing you. Marcus Webb had been a regular at the Drift. He was not a remarkable man by any of the metrics that society typically used to measure such things. He was 37 years old, of average height, of average build, with a face that was neither handsome nor plain but simply there, the kind of face that you could look at for an hour and then fail to pick out of a lineup. He had brown hair that he kept short because long hair interfered with the sealing surfaces of his work helmet, and brown eyes that had a slight cast to the left, a congenital condition that he had never bothered to get corrected because it did not affect his vision, and because the nearest corrective surgery facility was 14 jumps away. He had been a maintenance technician on KL-7 for 4 years. Before that, he had been a maintenance technician on a cargo freighter running supply routes between Omega-9 and the inner colonies. Before that, he had been an apprentice maintenance technician on a mining platform orbiting series. Before that, he had been a 19-year-old with a high school diploma and no particular ambition who had walked into a recruitment office on a rainy Tuesday in what used to be called Portland and said, "I'll take whatever you've got." He had always taken whatever they had. That was the defining characteristic of Marcus Webb if anyone had bothered to define him. He did not complain. He did not aspire. He did not look at the stars and wonder what was out there because he had already been out there and he knew that what was out there was largely the same as what was down here, problems that needed fixing, systems that needed maintaining, and long stretches of nothing in between. He was good at his job. That was the one thing people consistently said about him. Not brilliant, not creative, not innovative, just good, reliable. The kind of technician who showed up early, who checked his tools before every shift, who read the maintenance manuals that everyone else skimmed, and who could be trusted to find a problem without being told where to look. On a colony like KL-7, where every system was aging, every part was a compromise, and every replacement had to be improvised from whatever was available, that kind of reliability was worth more than genius. He played cards at the Drift on Friday nights. He was mediocre at cards. He won sometimes, lost more often, and never seemed to care about the outcome either way. He played because the card game was a social ritual, and Marcus Webb understood not intellectually but instinctively that social rituals were the glue that held small communities together. Someone had to sit at the card table. Someone had to fill the fourth chair. Someone had to be the reliable loser who kept the game going without making the winners feel guilty. He was that someone. He was also, as it turned out, the kind of someone who would hold a door shut with his body, while something on the other side tried to eat through his skull. Because the shuttle behind him needed 47 more seconds to clear the launch rail, and 47 seconds was not negotiable. But that part came later. The Dragon Egg was found on a Tuesday. A geological survey team had been mapping the southern ridge formations, routine work. The kind of thing that the coalition sent out every few years to update their records, not because anything useful was likely to be found, but because having up-to-date geological data was a box that needed checking on annual reports. The team consisted of 3 people: Dr. Lena Vasquez, a geologist who had requested the KL-7 assignment as a way to finish her doctoral research in glacial morphodynamics without the distraction of actually being around other people; Tamaz Reyes, a surveyor's assistant who was saving money to buy passage to a warmer planet; and Marcus Webb, who had been assigned to the team because his maintenance skills were needed to keep the survey equipment functioning in KL-7 punishing cold. They were 8 kilometers south of the colony, in a formation that Vasquez had labeled Ridge 7C on her maps, when Reyes noticed the collapsed mine shaft. It was not a mine that any of the colony's records mentioned. The entrance had been buried under a rockfall that was old enough to have been weathered smooth by decades of wind-blown ice crystals. They would have walked right past it if Reyes hadn't stumbled, his boot catching on a protrusion that turned out to be the corner of a metal support beam, the kind that had been used in early mining operations before synthetic composites became standard. Vasquez wanted to mark the location and move on. Reyes wanted to investigate. Webb said nothing, which, in the dynamic of the 3-person team, constituted a vote for investigation because Webb's silence generally meant he did not see a reason not to do something, and in his experience, that was as close to enthusiasm as you were going to get. They spent 2 hours clearing the entrance. Webb did most of the physical work, prying loose rocks, reinforcing the unstable sections with portable struts from the survey kit, setting up the portable lights that cast a flat blue-white glow into the darkness below. He did not complain about the cold or the effort or the fact that his fingers were going numb inside his insulated gloves. He simply worked with the same steady, unhurried efficiency that he brought to everything, and when the shaft was clear enough to enter, he was the first one down the ladder. The mine was shallow, maybe 30 meters deep, branching into 2 short tunnels that dead-ended after a few dozen meters each. The walls were raw stone, unrefined, showing the marks of hand tools rather than industrial equipment. Whoever had dug this mine had done it a long time ago with limited resources and had extracted something. There were pick marks on the walls, evidence of blasting in one of the tunnels, and a pile of tailings that had been sorted and partially removed. But none of that was what mattered. What mattered was in the second tunnel, at the dead end, in a small alcove that had been carved out of the rock with obvious care. The alcove was lined with a material that none of them recognized, something dark and slightly warm to the touch, with a texture like compressed velvet. And resting in the center of that lining, cradled as carefully as if someone had placed it there with deliberate reverence, was an egg. It was roughly the size of a football. Its shell was a deep, mottled gray, shot through with veins of darker color that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of the light. It was warm, noticeably warmer than the surrounding rock, warmer than the air in the mine, warmer than it had any right to be in a collapsed shaft on a frozen planet where the ambient temperature was negative 38 degrees. Vasquez said, "That's not geological." Reyes said a word that was not scientific. Webb said nothing. He stood in the alcove and looked at the egg, and something moved behind his eyes that was so unfamiliar that neither Vasquez nor Reyes noticed it because they had never seen it on his face before and would not have recognized it if they had. It was wonder. Marcus Webbs, who had never wondered at anything, wondered at the egg. They brought it back to the colonies. This was, by every protocol in the Interplanetary Aid Coalition's handbook, the wrong thing to do. Unknown biological specimens were to be documented in situ, photographed, sampled if possible without disturbing the specimen, and reported to the nearest xenobiological authority for professional retrieval. There were forms. There were procedures. There were very good reasons for all of it, most of which involved the fact that unknown biological specimens had a historically troubling tendency to be hostile, toxic, contagious, or all 3 simultaneously. Vasquez knew the protocols. She had been trained in them. She could recite the relevant sections of the Coalition's Biohazard Response Manual from memory, including the specific subsection on unclassified ovum-like structures, which she had once been tested on during her graduate comprehensive exams. She also knew that the nearest xenobiological authority was Omega-9, which was 14 jumps away, and that the next supply shuttle wasn't due for 6 weeks, and that the egg was warm in a place where warmth should not exist, and that if they left it in that collapsed mine shaft and something happened to it, if it cooled, if it died, if whatever was inside it was lost because of bureaucratic adherence to procedure, she would never forgive herself. So she authorized its removal. She would later justify this decision in a report that ran to 47 pages and cited 17 precedent cases and 3 emergency exemption clauses. And the report would be accepted without comment by a review board that had bigger things to worry about. And that would be the end of it from an administrative standpoint. From every other standpoint, it was the beginning of everything. Webb carried the egg back to the colony. He wrapped it in a thermal blanket from the survey kit and held it against his chest inside his coat, and he walked the 8 kilometers back through the wind and the cold with the kind of careful, steady attention that he usually reserved for delicate machinery. He did not slip. He did not hurry. He did not let the egg bump against anything or shift in his arms or lose contact with his body heat for even a moment. Reyes walked beside him and talked the entire way, nervous chatter that filled the silence and kept the cold from feeling as absolute. Vasquez walked behind them and watched Webb hold the egg and made a mental note that she would include in her report, a note about the technician's handling of the specimen, his instinctive care, the way he had positioned his hands to distribute pressure evenly across the shell. She did not write in her report what she actually thought, which was that Marcus Webb held the egg the way a parent holds a child, and that he did not seem to know he was doing it. The egg was placed in a warm compartment near the engine core of the colony's shuttle, a mid-sized transport vessel called the Kestrel that was used for supply runs to and from the relay stations. The compartment was not designed for biological storage, but it was the warmest sustained environment on the shuttle, and Vasquez had calculated that the egg's ambient temperature needed to be maintained at approximately 35 degrees Celsius, which the engine compartment could provide during pre-launch warm-up cycles. The shuttle was scheduled to launch in 3 days on a routine supply run to Omega-9. Vasquez intended to travel with the egg and deliver it personally to the xenobiology team at the station. She had already composed a preliminary report and transmitted it ahead, and the response from Omega-9 had been immediate and excited. The station's lead xenobiologist, a woman named Dr. Ananya Perk, had responded within the hour with a list of containment requirements and handling instructions and a personal note that said, simply, "This could be extraordinary. Please take every precaution." 2 days before launch, Webb went to the shuttle to check the engine compartment's temperature regulation system. This was not part of his assigned duties. The shuttle had its own maintenance crew, and Webb had no official reason to be there. But he went anyway, and he stood in the engine compartment with the egg resting in its thermal blanket on a shelf he had built from spare parts. And he checked the temperature readings. And he adjusted the calibration by half a degree because the readings seemed slightly high to him, and then he stood there for a while longer just looking at the egg. The veins in the shell seemed to pulse, very faintly, very slowly. A rhythm that was almost too subtle to be real, but that Webb could see when he looked at it long enough, the way you can see stars appear in the sky if you stare at a dark patch long enough, not because the stars are moving into view, but because your eyes are adjusting to a depth of perception they had previously been ignoring. He put his hand on the shell. It was warm, not the warm of an object that had been placed near a heat source, the warm of something that was generating its own heat, something alive. Something that was, even now in the darkness of its shell, growing and changing and becoming whatever it was meant to become. Marcus Webb stood in the engine compartment of a shuttle on a frozen planet at the edge of nowhere and pressed his palm against a dragon egg. And he felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not tell anyone about this. He would never tell anyone about this. It was too small and too large at the same time, and he did not have the words for it, and even if he had, the people in his life were not people he talked to about things that mattered. They were people he played cards with and fixed air recyclers for and stood next to in line at the mess hall. They were good people. He liked them. But there was a distance in Marcus Webb that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with a fundamental inability to let other people see the parts of himself that were soft. He removed his hand from the egg. He checked the temperature one more time. He left the shuttle and went back to his regular duties and did not think about the egg again until that night, when he lay in his bunk in the dormitory he shared with 3 other men and stared at the ceiling and felt a phantom warmth in his palm that would not fade. The screamers came on a Wednesday. There was no warning, there was never warning with screamers. They did not travel in ships that could be detected on scanners. They did not broadcast signals or leave trails or announce their intentions in any way that the technology of settled space could intercept. They appeared, that was what they did. They appeared in a place and then people started dying, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was usually too late. They were called screamers because of the sound their victims made. Not everyone screamed, some went silent, their faces locked in expressions of absolute blankness, as if whatever had been inside them had been removed so cleanly that there was nothing left to generate a response. But enough people screamed that the name stuck. The sound was distinctive, a high, thin shriek that started in the chest and climbed until it passed beyond the range of human hearing, leaving behind a silence that was somehow worse than the scream itself. Screamers fed on neural tissue. Specifically, they fed on the electrical patterns stored in neural tissue, memories, personality, the accumulated weight of experience that made a person who they were. They did not eat the brain itself. They left the physical organ intact, a grayish mass of unchanged cellular structure. What they took was invisible to any scan that did not specifically look for it, which meant that early encounters with screamers had been baffling, bodies found with no visible cause of death, autopsies that revealed nothing, entire populations dead in their homes with cups of tea still warm beside them, and expressions on their faces that suggested they had simply stopped being. It took 3 colony losses before anyone understood what was happening. It took 5 more before a partial countermeasure was developed, a broadband psychic dampener that could disrupt the screamers' feeding process and drive them away, though it could not kill them. Nothing could kill them. They were not biological in any conventional sense. They were not mechanical. They were not energy beings in the way that theoretical physics understood energy beings. They were something else, something that existed in the spaces between categories, something that the best minds in xenobiology had spent decades studying without reaching a consensus on what exactly they were. The only thing everyone agreed on was that when screamers appeared, you left. You left immediately. You left everything behind. You left your home and your possessions and your photographs and your keepsakes and the bar where you played cards on Friday nights, and you ran, and you did not look back because looking back was how you died. The colony on Kale 7 had a screamer response protocol. It had been updated 18 months before the attack, after a near miss on a neighboring world had prompted the coalition to review and revise evacuation procedures across the frontier. The protocol was clear. Upon confirmed screamer contact, all personnel proceed to designated evacuation points, all non-essential systems are to be abandoned, the shuttle is to be prepped for immediate launch, and the order of boarding is determined by a priority matrix that placed children first, then medical personnel, then anyone with skills critical to the colony's re-establishment elsewhere. Marcus Webb was not in any of the priority categories. He was a maintenance technician with no dependents, no specialized medical training, and no skills that could not be replicated by any of the 4 other maintenance technicians on the colony. By the strict logic of the protocol, he should have been in the last boarding group, the one that filled the remaining seats after everyone else had loaded, the one that was sometimes left behind entirely if the shuttle reached capacity before everyone in the group had boarded. He was not in the last boarding group when the screamers hit Kale 7. He was not in any boarding groups. He was at the shuttle. The first confirmed screamer sighting was at the northern perimeter, reported by a sensor operator named Daniel Park who had been monitoring the perimeter array as part of his regular shift. Park saw the readings spike, a pattern of electromagnetic interference that matched the known screamer profile, and hit the alarm. The alarm went out across the colony at 14:37 local time. The shuttle was in the middle of its pre-launch warm-up cycle. The egg was in its compartment near the engine core. Vasquez was already on board, having traveled to the shuttle early to perform a final check on the egg's containment. She had been carrying a handheld scanner and a set of detailed instructions from Dr. Perk, and she had been so focused on the egg that she did not hear the alarm at first. When she did hear it, she understood what it meant immediately, because everyone on the frontier understood what the screamer alarm meant. She ran to the cockpit and began the launch sequence. The Kestrel's pilot, a woman named Sergeant Yuki Tanaka who was technically on loan from the Coalition's Transportation Corps, was already in the pilot seat and had the engines spooling before Vasquez reached her. Tanaka was calm. Tanaka was always calm. She had been through 2 screamer evacuations before and had developed a professional detachment toward them that her colleagues found either admirable or unnerving, depending on their own capacity for denial. "Go," Tanaka said. "Tell everyone to go. I need 7 minutes for full launch readiness." Vasquez ran to the cargo bay and opened the outer doors. People were coming. Not running, the evacuation protocol explicitly discouraged running, because running caused stampedes and stampedes killed more people than screamers did in the initial phase of an attack. But moving quickly, deliberately, with the controlled urgency of people who had drilled for this moment and were following the script. Children first. 31 children, from infants to a 15-year-old named Priya Sharma who was technically too old for the priority category but who had been placed there by the colony's administrator because she had a broken leg and could not move quickly on her own. Then medical personnel. Dr. Hensley, the colony's only doctor, refused to board until 3 of his patients who were too immobile to walk were carried on. 2 nurses followed. Then critical skills. The agricultural specialist who knew how to set up hydroponic systems from scratch, the water reclamation engineer, the communications officer. People filled the cargo bay. The Kestrel was designed to carry 60 passengers in emergency configuration, and the colony had 612 residents. The math was brutal and everyone knew it. The shuttle could make multiple trips if there was time, but screamer attacks did not typically allow for multiple trips. The standard model was 1 shuttle, 1 chance, everyone who fit, everyone else dies. Vasquez stood at the cargo bay door and counted heads and tried not to think about the math. She counted 42 people, 42, out of 612. The number was so small that it felt abstract, like a statistic from a historical document, rather than a real count of real people standing in a real cargo bay on a real day that had started as a normal Wednesday and had become something else entirely. Marcus Webb was not among the 42. She noticed this because she knew Webb not well but well enough to recognize his absence. He had been assigned to the survey team that found the egg. He had built the shelf in the engine compartment. He had checked the temperature calibration 2 days before. He was supposed to be here. She was about to say something, to ask if anyone had seen him, to send someone to look when the screaming started. It came from the north. A sound that was not quite a sound, a vibration that bypassed the ears and went directly to the brainstem, triggering every primitive alarm in the human nervous system simultaneously. People in the cargo bay flinched. Some covered their ears. A child started crying. The 2 nurses moved to sedate the child, because the protocol said that unconscious passengers were easier to manage. And the protocol was the protocol, and the protocol was the only thing standing between order and chaos. Then the power fluctuated. The lights in the cargo bay flickered, dimmed, came back. The shuttle's engines, which had been building toward launch readiness, coughed and sputtered. Tanaka's voice came over the intercom, tight for the first time since Vasquez had known her. "We've got interference. Something's messing with the engine start sequence. I need 2 minutes to bypass." 2 minutes? On a normal day, 2 minutes was nothing. On this day, with the screaming getting louder and the lights flickering and the temperature in the cargo bay dropping because the environmental systems were also fluctuating, 2 minutes was an eternity. Vasquez looked at the cargo bay doors. They were still open. The outer door led to the launch pad, which led to the colony's central thoroughfare, which led to the northern perimeter where the screaming was coming from. She could see the thoroughfare from where she stood. It was empty. Everyone who was going to come had come. The 42 people in the cargo bay were the 42 people who were going to live. Except for Marcus Webb. She saw him then. He was running, actually running, breaking the protocol, moving fast across the thoroughfare toward the shuttle. But he was not running toward the cargo bay doors. He was running toward the side of the shuttle, toward the service hatch that led to the engine compartment, and in his arms he was carrying something that she could not immediately identify. He reached the service hatch and slammed his palm against the release. The hatch did not open. It was locked, standard procedure during pre-launch because the engine compartment was a dangerous place to be during engine ignition. Webb hit the release again. Nothing. He braced his feet against the shuttle's hull and pulled on the hatch with both hands, and whatever he was carrying shifted in his grip, but he did not let go of it, and Vasquez saw what it was and understood. The egg. He had gone back for the egg. He had gone back for the egg while a screamer attack was in progress, while the colony was dying around him, while the shuttle was about to launch. And he had retrieved it from the engine compartment, and now he could not get it back inside because the service hatch was locked, and he did not have the override code because he was a maintenance technician and not a shuttle crew member. And the screaming was getting closer, and the lights were flickering again. And Tanaka's voice came over the intercom saying 30 seconds to engine start, close the cargo doors. And Vasquez was standing at the cargo bay door controls, and she had to make a decision. She made it. She hit the door close switch. The cargo bay doors began to close. Through the narrowing gap, she could see Webb still at the service hatch, still pulling, still holding the egg. She could see something behind him, a shape in the thoroughfare that was not a human shape, that was not any shape she could describe in language because language was built for things that existed within the categories of reality, and this thing did not. It was an absence of light, a warp in the air, a place where the visual field simply stopped making sense. A screamer. Webb saw it, he turned, and for 1 second, one brief, frozen second that Vasquez would replay in her mind for the rest of her life, their eyes met through the closing gap in the cargo bay doors. His eyes were brown and slightly cast to the left, and they were not afraid. They were not calm either. They were something else, something focused, something absolute. He turned from the service hatch. He moved to the main cargo bay door, the one that was closing, the one that Vasquez was standing at. He was not going to make it. The gap was too narrow. The screamer was too close. The math did not work. Webb pushed the egg through the gap. He pushed it with both hands, shoving it across the floor of the cargo bay with a force that sent it sliding into the feet of one of the nurses, who stumbled backward and looked down at the egg with an expression of total confusion that would never fully resolve, because the next thing that happened was that Marcus Webb put his body between the closing door and the screamer and held the door shut. He held it with his hands, with his shoulders, with every ounce of force that a 37-year-old maintenance technician who had never been remarkable at anything could generate. The hydraulic door mechanism, designed to close with enough force to create an airtight seal, was fighting against him, and he was fighting back, and the gap narrowed to the width of his arm and then his wrist and then his fingers. And through that gap, Vasquez could see his face pressed against the door frame, and she could see the thing behind him getting closer, and she could see his lips move. He was not screaming. He was saying something, so quietly that even in the silence that had fallen over the cargo bay, the silence of 42 people watching a man die through a closing door, she could not hear the words. She read them on his lips instead. Take care of it. The door sealed. The shuttle lurched. Tanaka's voice, we're up, we're clear, we're gone. The cargo bay erupted. People crying, people screaming, people holding each other, people collapsing to the floor. The children were sedated. The doctor was checking vitals. The communications officer was trying to raise anyone on any channel. Vasquez stood at the closed door and stared at the seam where it met the frame and did not move. The egg sat on the floor at her feet. It was warm. The veins in its shell were pulsing faster now, as if it could sense the agitation around it, as if it knew that something had happened, as if it understood in whatever way an unhatched thing could understand that the man who had carried it for 8 kilometers through the cold and held it in the dark, and gone back for it when everything was falling apart, was not coming back. Vasquez picked up the egg. She held it the way Webb had held it, against her chest, inside her coat, cradled in both hands. It was not the same. She was not Webb. The egg did not respond to her the way it had responded to him. But she held it anyway because he had asked her to, and because asking had been the bravest thing she had ever seen a person do, and because she did not know what else to do with the silence that was inside her. The Kestrel jumped to relay station Omega 9 6 hours later. The egg was placed in a temporary containment unit in the station's medical wing. Vasquez wrote her report, all 47 pages of it, and submitted it, and then sat in her assigned quarters and did not sleep for 3 days. The egg hatched 2 days after arrival at Omega 9. Dr. Ananya Perk was present. She had been present for every moment since the egg's arrival, monitoring it with equipment borrowed from 3 different departments, recording data that she already knew would be the foundation of her career. When the shell cracked, a thin, precise fracture that ran from the top of the egg downward in a line that looked almost designed, Perk was kneeling in front of the containment unit with a handheld recorder and a look on her face that she would later describe as the closest I have ever come to religious experience. The hatchling emerged slowly, not struggling, not frantic, but deliberate, pulling itself out of the shell with a clumsy grace that was immediately viscerally endearing. It was small, the size of a large kitten, with a body that was mostly head and a head that was mostly eyes. Its scales were the color of wet ash, a gray so soft and muted that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its wings were crumpled against its back, tiny folded things that looked like they had been packed for storage and not yet unfolded. Its claws were translucent, like glass, and too large for its feet, giving it an awkward, oversized look that made it seem even more fragile than it already was. It opened its eyes. They were dark, not black. There was depth in them, layers of color that shifted between brown and gold and something that was not quite either. They were the eyes of something ancient looking out from a face that was impossibly young, and when they focused on Perk, she felt something happen in her chest that was not a medical event but was nonetheless real. The hatchling opened its mouth and made a sound. It was not a roar, it was not a hiss. It was a high, thin squeal, the sound of something frightened and cold and alone in a place it did not recognize, calling for something it could not name. It was the sound of a baby in every language that had ever existed, saying, "Where am I and where are you and why is it so bright and why does everything feel wrong?" Perk reached into the containment unit. The hatchling bit her. Not hard, its jaw was not strong enough to do real damage, but decisively with an intention that was clear. Do not touch me. Perk pulled her hand back and looked at the tiny teeth marks on her finger and understood. The hatchling was not afraid, it was looking for something. It was looking for the person whose heartbeat it had heard through the shell for 3 days. The steady, unhurried rhythm that had been the first sound it had ever known. The sound it had imprinted on in the darkness before it was born. The sound that was now absent from a world that was too bright and too cold and full of people who were not the right person. Marcus Webb was dead. And the dragon that had been born because of him did not know how to accept that. They named her Asha. Perk chose the name over the objections of colleagues who said that nomming created attachment and attachment created bias and bias compromised research. Perk said that the hatchling needed a designation for record-keeping purposes, and that Subject 7C1 was not a designation, it was a bureaucratic sentence, and that if her colleagues wanted to refer to a living creature by a number they could do so in their own papers but they would not do so in hers. Asha did not care what she was called. Asha did not care about much of anything because Asha was not well. The first weeks were difficult in ways that the xenobiology team had not anticipated. Asha refused food for the first 4 days. Not refused in the way a sick animal refuses food lethargically without appetite. Refused in the way a child refuses food when they are angry at you deliberately with eye contact, pushing the nutrient packets away with her 2 large claws and making a sound that was unmistakably contemptuous. On the 5th day she ate. But she ate only when no one was watching. The monitoring cameras captured it Asha alone in her enclosure at 03:47 station time, tearing open a nutrient packet with her glass claws and consuming the contents in quick, efficient motions, then carefully hiding the empty packet under the bedding material as if to conceal the evidence. She was hungry, she was not going to let them know she was hungry. Perk recognized this behavior. She had seen it in rescued animals, the ones that had been traumatized, the ones that had learned that showing need was dangerous. Asha had been alive for 5 days and had already learned that showing need was dangerous. The question was who had taught her. Nobody had. She had been born into an enclosure on a space station, handled by professionals who had done everything right by every standard in the field. She had not been mistreated. She had not been neglected. She had been fed and monitored and kept warm and safe. And she was still traumatized. Because the trauma was not in the afterbirth, it was in the before birth. It was in the 3 days inside the shell on the Kestrel when she had heard the screaming and felt the vibrations of the shuttle's stressed hull and sensed, through whatever embryonic perception dragons possessed, that the world outside her shell was coming apart. And then, worst of all, the thing that had broken something in her before she was even fully formed, she had felt the heartbeat stop. Not go away, not fade, stop. The steady rhythm that had been her entire universe had stopped, and there had been a gap, seconds, maybe minutes, she had no way to measure time. And then the shuttle had jumped and the rhythm had not come back and she had been alone in the dark with nothing but the memory of a sound that would never sound again. Asha was not hostile because she was a dragon. She was hostile because she was grieving. And she was grieving for a man she had never met. The months that followed were a slow, grinding exercise in frustration for everyone involved. Asha grew slowly because she was not eating enough, but she grew. Her scales began to harden, the wet ash gray deepening to something more durable. Her wings unfolded incrementally, stretching during sleep, folding again when she woke like flowers that only bloomed in darkness. Her claws shed their translucence and became opaque, a darker gray than her scales, sharp enough now to leave marks on the enclosure walls. She interacted with no one. Perk tried. She sat outside Asha's enclosure every day for the first month, reading aloud from texts on dragon biology, not because she thought Asha understood the words, but because she wanted the hatchling to hear a human voice that was calm and present and not going away. Asha ignored her. Not actively, she did not attack or hiss or make threatening gestures. She simply sat on the far side of her enclosure, facing the wall, and existed in a space that was physically close to Perk, but emotionally on another planet entirely. Other handlers tried. A young intern named James Okoro spent 3 weeks attempting to establish contact through food-based bonding, offering Asha increasingly exotic nutrient preparations in the hope that something would appeal to her. Asha ate the food when he was not looking and ignored him when he was. Okoro eventually requested a transfer, not because Asha was difficult but because, in his words, it hurts to be rejected by something that small. A military consultant named Colonel Hess suggested a more forceful approach, controlled exposure, essentially, where Asha would be placed in situations that required her to interact with handlers whether she wanted to or not. Perk rejected this so forcefully that the military consultant filed a formal complaint about her conduct, which was then buried in administrative backlog and forgotten about. Which was how things worked on Omega-9 when the people involved were too low-ranking for anyone to care about their opinions. Through it all, Asha sat in her enclosure and stared at the wall and grew, and the something inside her that was broken did not heal. Perk began to notice patterns. Asha was not completely unresponsive. She reacted to certain stimuli, specifically to sounds that fell within the frequency range of a human heartbeat. The station's environmental systems produced a low hum that was close to this range, and Perk observed that Asha would sometimes turn her head toward the hum, her ears, small, fin-like structures on either side of her skull, rotating to track the sound with a precision that suggested active listening rather than passive awareness. More tellingly, Asha slept in a specific position every night, curled into a tight ball with her nose tucked under her tail and her body pressed flat against the floor of her enclosure. She always oriented herself in the same direction, toward the station's starboard side, which by the alignment of Omega-9's docking configuration pointed roughly toward KL7. Perk checked the math on this 3 times. The orientation was not exact. It was off by about 12 degrees, which was within the margin of error for a creature navigating by instinct rather than instrumentation. But it was consistent, every night without exception. Asha was sleeping in the direction of Marcus Webb's grave. The escape happened on a Tuesday, 3 months after hatching, 4 months since Webb's death. Perk did not understand how it was possible. The enclosure had 3 locking mechanisms, a magnetic seal, a mechanical latch, and a biometric reader that required an authorized palm print to disengage from the outside. There was no way for a creature inside the enclosure to trigger any of these locks. There was no physical access to the locking mechanisms from inside. The design had been reviewed by 2 independent security consultants and certified as escape-proof for creatures up to and including Class 4 predatory species, which was a category that included animals capable of biting through steel cable. Asha was not capable of biting through steel cable. Asha was barely capable of biting through the nutrient packet packaging without making a mess. And yet at 02:15 station time, the monitoring system recorded all 3 locks disengaging simultaneously, the magnetic seal releasing, the mechanical latch sliding open, the biometric reader flashing an authorization code that did not correspond to any registered user, and Asha walked out of her enclosure at a calm, unhurried pace that suggested she had been planning this for a while. The security footage showed her moving through the station's corridors with a sureness of direction that was impossible to explain. She had never been outside her enclosure. She had never seen the station's layout. She had no way of knowing where she was going. She went to Cargo Bay 4. She went to Cargo Bay 4 because that was where a supply drone was being prepped for an automated run to Kale 7, a routine resupply mission for the monitoring equipment that the Coalition still maintained on the dead colony, more out of bureaucratic inertia than any practical purpose. The drone was a large, boxy thing with no passenger accommodations and minimal environmental controls. Its cargo bay was unheated, unpressurized, and not designed for living creatures of any kind. Asha climbed inside. The drone launched at 0400 station time. The launch was automatic, triggered by a pre-programmed schedule. No one saw Asha board. No one checked the cargo bay before launch because no one knew to check the cargo bay because no one knew Asha was out of her enclosure until 04:23 when a night shift technician walked past the open enclosure and triggered an alarm. By then, the drone was already in transit. Perk watched the retrieval footage, the drone's external cameras recording Asha's entry into the cargo bay, and felt something inside her that was not despair and not grief but a terrible, admiring recognition. Asha had not escaped because she was unhappy. She had not escaped because she was panicked or confused or acting on destructive impulse. She had escaped because she had a destination, and the destination was not on Omega-9, and she had figured out how to get there with the same quiet, stubborn competence that she had inherited from a man who had once walked 8 kilometers through a frozen wind, holding an egg he did not understand because walking was what you did when something needed carrying. Asha was going home. The drone took 3 weeks to reach KL7. It was a slow, automated transit, no-jump capability, just steady sublight propulsion through the void between relay points. The cargo bay was cold. Not as cold as open space, the drone had basic radiation shielding that provided minimal thermal insulation, but cold enough that a human would have died within hours. Asha was not human. She was a dragon, and dragons, even hatchlings, were built from materials that did not follow the same rules as other living things. Her scales, still soft, still immature, provided better insulation than any synthetic fabric ever designed. Her metabolism, which had been sluggish from underfeeding, dropped into a state of torpor that reduced her caloric needs to almost nothing. She did not eat, she did not drink, she did not move. Oh, she slept. And in her sleep she dreamed, if dragons dreamed, which Perk believed they did, because the monitoring equipment had recorded REM-like patterns in Asha's brain activity during her time in the enclosure. And things that exhibited REM patterns dreamed, that was just biology, she dreamed of a heartbeat. Steady, unhurried, slightly arrhythmic in a way that felt like a pattern rather than a flaw. A heartbeat that was not hers but that was, in some way that predated language and logic and the entire concept of self hers. A heartbeat that had been the first thing she knew and the thing she had lost and the thing she was going to find again because finding it was the only thing that mattered. The drone entered Kale 7 atmosphere on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks to the day after it launched, and roughly 3 months and a week since Marcus Webb had died. The descent was rough. Automated drones were not designed for atmospheric entry on planets with Kale 7 particular atmospheric profile, thin air, high crosswinds, unpredictable ice crystal formations at altitude. The drone bucked and shuddered, and at one point rolled nearly 90 degrees before its stabilization systems corrected. Asha did not wake up. The drone landed hard, 2 kilometers south of the dead colony, in a flat expanse of frozen ground that had once been a wheat field. The impact cracked the drone's outer hull and jammed the cargo bay doors partially open. Cold air, Kale 7 native cold, the real cold, the cold that had been waiting for 3 years for the humans to leave so it could have its planet back, poured into the cargo bay. Asha woke up. She lay in the broken drone for 6 hours, motionless, while the cold seeped through her scales and into the tissue beneath. She was not adapting to the cold, she was enduring it. There was a difference. Adapting meant changing your parameters to match the environment. Enduring meant keeping your parameters exactly as they were and letting the environment do its worst because what you were was more important than what was happening to you. At the 6-hour mark, she moved. She pulled herself out of the cargo bay through the jammed doors, dragging her hind legs because they had gone stiff from the cold and from 3 weeks of disuse. She dropped to the frozen ground, a fall of about a meter, undignified and ungraceful, her chin hitting the ice with a crack that would have been concerning if anyone had been there to hear it. No one was there to hear it. She stood up, she shook herself, a full-body motion that started at her nose and traveled to the tip of her tail, dislodging a thin layer of frost that had formed on her scales during the fall. She looked around. Kale 7 stretched out before her in every direction, flat, white, frozen, empty. The colony was visible to the north, a cluster of structures that had once been buildings and were now shells, their windows dark, their walls cracked by the cold, their outlines softened by the snow that had accumulated against them over 3 years of neglect. The sky was the color of old bone, featureless, a ceiling without a sky behind it. Asha had never seen Kale 7 before. She had not existed when the colony was alive. She had no memories of this place, no experiential framework for understanding what she was looking at. She knew where to go. She started walking. It took her 2 hours to reach the colony. 2 hours of slow, painful progress across frozen ground, her stiff legs gradually loosening, her body temperature gradually rising as her metabolism climbed out of torpor and back toward something resembling normal function. She was hungry, she was thirsty. She was cold in a way that went beyond physical discomfort and into a territory that was closer to spiritual offense. The cold of a world that had no place for her, that was trying to reject her, that wanted her to turn around and go back to the warm box on the space station where she belonged. She did not turn around. She entered the colony through what had once been the main gate, a gap in the perimeter fence where a section had been torn away, probably by the screamers during the attack. The metal posts bent and twisted like something had squeezed through them that was larger than the gap should have allowed. She walked past buildings she did not recognize. Past the drift, its door hanging open, the interior visible as a dark rectangle that smelled, even through the cold and the 3 years of stagnation, faintly of fermented grain. Past the community center, its warped basketball court now a shallow depression filled with ice. Past the school, its windows broken, books scattered across the floor by whatever animals or weather had found their way inside. She walked past all of it without stopping, because none of it was what she was looking for. She found the cemetery at the southern edge of the colony, exactly where it had always been, a grid of stone markers on dead grass under a bone-white sky. There were 43 markers. She did not count them. She did not need to count them. She walked along the rows with her nose close to the ground, reading the stones the way dragons read things, not with eyes but with the network of sensory organs that ran along her jaw and connected to a part of her brain that humans did not have a name for. She was smelling for something, not a scent, not a chemical signature, something deeper. Something that had been left behind when Marcus Webb was buried, not his body, not his belongings, but the residue of his presence, the psychic equivalent of a footprint, the thing that remained when everything else was gone. She found it. The grave was in the 3rd row, 7th from the left. The marker was rough stone, unevenly cut, with letters carved by a hand that was not used to carving. The middle name was misspelled Marcus James Webb instead of Marcus James Webb because the person who had carved it had been crying too hard to see straight, and nobody had fixed it because by the time anyone noticed, the colony was empty and it did not matter anymore. Asha stopped at the grave. She stood over it with her head down and her eyes half closed and her body very still, and she made a sound. It was not the squeal she had made when she hatched. It was not the contemptuous sound she made when handlers approached. It was something new, a low, resonant tone that came from deep in her chest and traveled through her body and into the ground beneath her feet, as if she was sending a signal downward, into the earth, into whatever was left of Marcus Webb beneath the stone. The sound lasted for a long time, minutes, maybe longer. The wind blew and the cold pressed in and the sky watched with its blank, bone-white indifference, and a Shah stood over the grave and sang, because that was what it was, not a call or a cry or a keening but a song, slow and mournful and achingly beautiful in a way that would have made a human weep if a human had been there to hear it. No human was there to hear it. When the song ended, a Shah lay down on the grave. She curled into her sleeping position, nose under tail, body flat, oriented toward the station's starboard side even though there was no station and no starboard side, just the endless flat white of Kale 7 in every direction. She closed her eyes. She did not move. The screamers had not returned to this part of the colony. Perhaps the residual psychic noise of so many dead humans was unpleasant to them, a quality of suffering that they had already consumed and could not feed on again like a meal that had been picked clean. Perhaps they simply had no reason to come back. The colony was empty. There was nothing left to eat. Whatever migratory pattern drove them had moved on to other worlds, other populations, other screams. Whatever the reason, a Shah was left alone. She lay on the grave and the cold pressed against her and the wind blew and the sky watched and she did not move. She was not sleeping, not at first. She was lying in the way that a person lies when they have cried themselves out and there is nothing left inside but a hollow where the grief used to be. Her eyes were closed but her mind was awake, turning over and over the same thought that had been her only thought since she hatched. You were supposed to be here, you were supposed to be here, you were supposed to be here. She had never seen his face. She had never heard his voice, not the voice that formed words, only the voice that was a heartbeat, that was a rhythm, that was the first and only proof she had ever had that the universe contained something worth existing for. She did not know his name. She did not know what he looked like or how he walked or what sound he made when he laughed, if he ever laughed. She knew that he had held her. She knew this the way she knew how to breathe, not as a memory but as a fact embedded in her cells, woven into the architecture of her being. 8 kilometers through the cold, against his chest, inside his coat, the steady warmth of him surrounding her, the steady rhythm of him beneath her, the steady presence of him saying without words, I have you, you are safe, I will not let go. He had let go. He had let go because something had made him, because something had taken him, because the universe was a place where things like him, steady, reliable, unremarkable, good, were taken first and most often, as if the cosmos had a specific appetite for the kind of person who would hold a door shut with his body so that something small and helpless could survive. A Shah did not understand any of this in the way a human would understand it. She did not have the cognitive framework for philosophical reasoning about the nature of loss. She was a baby, 3 months old, in a body that was not yet fully formed, with a brain that was still developing the structures it would need to process complex thought. But dragons were not bound by the cognitive frameworks of other species. They never had been. They experienced the world through channels that humans could detect but not interpret, electromagnetic fields, gravitational microvariations, quantum-level fluctuations that most organic nervous systems filtered out as noise. And through those channels, a Shah perceived something about the grave beneath her that no human instrument would have been able to detect. She perceived that the ground was not empty. Beneath the stone, beneath the soil, beneath the frozen earth of Kale 7, there was a residue. Not a soul. A Shah did not believe in souls because souls were a human concept and a Shah was not human. But a pattern, the pattern of Marcus Webb. The electrical architecture of his neural tissue, the magnetic signature of his heartbeat, the quantum fingerprint of every atom that had ever been part of his body. It was all there, dispersed through the soil like a blueprint scattered by wind, but there, incomplete, inactive, unreachable by any means that current science understood but present. A dragon could feel it the way a human could feel sunlight on their skin. Not as data but as sensation, not as information but as knowledge, direct and unmediated and absolutely certain. He was there. Not alive, not dead in any permanent sense. Something in between, something waiting. A Shah did not know what to do about this. She was a baby. She had no tools, no technology, no understanding of the physics involved. All she had was herself, her body, her instinct, and the strange, unnamed force that lived inside every dragon and that humans had spent centuries trying to quantify and had never succeeded in numbing. She lay on the grave and she pressed her belly against the cold stone, and she closed her eyes and she reached. Not physically, not with her claws or her snout or any part of her body that could be seen or measured. She reached with the part of herself that was dragon, the part that operated on principles that were not principles, that followed rules that were not rules, that did things that were not possible because dragons did not care about what was possible. Possible was a human word. Possible was a human limitation. Dragons had never been limited by possible. Asha reached down through the stone and the soil and the frozen earth, and she found the pattern and she held it. She held it the way he had held her. With both hands, with everything she had, with a stubbornness that looked small from the outside and was, on the inside, larger than the grave and the cold and the empty sky and the entire frozen planet put together. She held on, and she did not let go. Days passed, the cold did not kill her. It should have. By any biological standard, by every model the xenobiologists had for dragon thermal tolerance, by the simple mathematics of heat transfer in a sub-zero environment, Asha should have died within the first 48 hours. She did not die. Her body temperature dropped, but it dropped to a specific point and then stopped, as if it had found a threshold and decided that going below it was not acceptable. Her metabolism slowed further, deeper than torpor, into a state that had no name in the scientific literature, because no one had ever observed it before. A state of suspended animation that was not quite hibernation and not quite death, and not quite anything that could be explained by the application of known biological principles. She lay on the grave and did not move and did not eat and did not drink, and the cold pressed against her and the wind blew and the sky watched, and beneath her, so faintly that nothing on the planet could have detected it except the creature that was lying on top of it, something stirred. A pattern held in small claws, kept alive by sheer refusal to stop holding it. A heartbeat that was not a heartbeat, echoing in the frozen ground. A man who was not alive, waiting in the dark for something to finish what it had started. And on top of it all, a dragon baby, ash-gray scales, crumpled wings, eyes too old for her face, who had crossed an ocean of empty space and landed on a dead world and walked 2 kilometers on frozen legs and found a misspelled name on a rough stone marker and lain down on it and said, in the only language she had ever known, "I am here as you are not alone, I will not let go." This was day 1. There would be 13 more. And on the 14th day it would rain. And something beneath the stone would answer. On the 14th day it rained. Kale 7 rain was not like rain anywhere else in the settled galaxy. It was not the fat, warm drops that fell on the tropical colonies of Veritas, where children ran barefoot through puddles and the air smelled like wet flowers. It was not the gray, persistent drizzle of London or Seattle or any of the old Earth cities that people still referenced in conversation as shorthand for a particular kind of melancholy weather. It was not even the chemically aggressive acid rain that fell on the industrial worlds of the Vannies corridor, where you could watch it eat through a vehicle's paint job in real time if you were foolish enough to stand outside and watch. Kale 7 rain was thin, so thin that it barely qualified as rain at all, more like a mist that had ambitions beyond its station, a vapor that had decided, for reasons known only to itself, to commit to a downward trajectory and see it through despite having no real mass to speak of. It did not fall in drops. It fell in threads, impossibly fine, almost invisible, catching the pale light of the sky and turning it into a lattice of silver lines that hung in the air for a moment before dissolving against whatever surface they found. It was cold, of course it was cold. Everything on Kale 7 was cold. But the cold of the rain was a different quality than the cold of the air or the cold of the ground. It was a wet cold, a seeping cold, a cold that did not simply press against you but entered you, finding the gaps in your defenses, the space between scales, the soft tissue around the eyes, the thin membrane of the inner ear, and insinuating itself into those gaps with a patience that was almost personal. It was the cold of a world that wanted you to know, with every molecule of moisture it could deploy, that you were not welcome here. It was also acidic, though only mildly. Not enough to cause immediate harm to organic tissue. The colony's environmental reports had classified Kale 7 rain as level 2 corrosive, which meant it would discolor metal over time and irritate sensitive skin after prolonged exposure, but would not in the short term eat through anything that a living creature needed to keep intact. For a human, standing in Kale 7 rain for an hour would result in a mild stinging sensation on exposed skin and a lingering smell of something faintly metallic, like pennies left in a glass of water. For a dragon hatchling with scales that were still soft, still immature, still months away from the full density they would eventually achieve, the rain was an irritation not dangerous but persistent, like a sound that was not quite loud enough to be deafening but was too constant to be ignored. Asha did not ignore it. She felt it land on her scales, hundreds of threads, thousands, each one a tiny point of contact that her nervous system registered and catalogued and filed away in the vast, non-linear database that was a dragon's perception of the physical world. She felt it run between her scales and pool in the small depressions where her body met the stone beneath her. She felt it trace the ridges of her spine and collect in the crumpled folds of her wings and drip from the tips of the claws that were still slightly too large for her feet, giving her an awkward, slightly disproportionate look that would not fully resolve until her second shed. She felt all of it and she did not move. She had not moved in 14 days. 14 days since she had lain down on the grave. 14 days since she had closed her eyes and reached down into the frozen earth with whatever invisible, unnameable part of herself dragons used to do the things that dragons did that could not be explained by any framework that human science had ever devised. 14 days of cold and wind and darkness. Kale's 7 nights were long, 18 hours of near-total blackness punctuated only by the faint, distant light of the system's star, which was a small, tired thing that seemed to shine out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. And through all of it, Asha had lain on the stone and held on. She had not eaten. Her body had entered the nameless state that the xenobiologists would later argue about for years, a state of metabolic suspension so profound that her calorie requirements had dropped to something approaching zero. She was not consuming energy. She was not generating waste. She was, by every measurable criterion that biology could apply, functioning at a level so close to death that the difference was academic. But she was not dead. Her heart was beating. Slowly, far more slowly than any living creature's heart had a right to beat, perhaps once every 30 seconds, a rhythm so languid that it would have been undetectable by any standard medical equipment, but beating. Her lungs were drawing air, though the breaths were so shallow and so infrequent that they barely disturbed the thin layer of frost that had accumulated on her scales. Her brain was generating electrical activity, though the patterns were unlike anything recorded in any species. A slow, rolling waveform that Perk would later describe as like watching a tide pool, nothing dramatic, nothing fast but always moving, always alive beneath the surface. Asha was alive because Asha refused to be otherwise. This was not stubbornness in the human sense. Human stubbornness was a psychological response, a decision, conscious or unconscious, to persist in a course of action despite opposition. It involved ego and identity and a self-concept that included the idea of not giving up. It was a complex, higher-order cognitive function that required a sophisticated neural architecture to sustain. Asha did not have a sophisticated neural architecture. She was a baby. Her brain was still developing. The structures that would eventually support complex reasoning, abstract thought, and the dragon equivalent of self-awareness were not yet fully formed. What she had was something else, something deeper. Something that existed below the level of cognition, below the level of instinct, below the level of anything that could be isolated in a brain scan or mapped on a neural diagram. It was a force not mechanical, not electrical, not chemical, that animated her body and directed her actions, and kept her heart beating at 1/30th of its normal rate in temperatures that should have stopped it entirely. Dragons had always had this. It was the thing that made them impossible to classify, impossible to fully understand, impossible to contain within the neat taxonomic boxes that human science liked to build for the universe. Humans called it many things: adaptive anomaly, reality-indexed biology, ontological persistence. None of the terms were satisfying. None of them captured what it actually was, which was something closer to will, not the will of a mind, but the will of a kind, the accumulated refusal of an entire species to obey the rules that governed everything else. Asha lay on Marcus Webb's grave in the acid rain on a dead planet, and she would not stop. And the universe, which had rules about things that should and should not be able to continue, looked at her and did not know what to do. The rain accumulated. It pooled in the low places on the stone marker, the slight depressions caused by 3 years of weathering, the tiny cracks that had formed as the stone expanded and contracted with temperature cycles. It ran down the sides of the marker in thin rivulets and soaked into the frozen ground at the base, where it refroze almost immediately, adding another microscopic layer to the permafrost that encased the grave. It also, after several hours, found the crack. The crack was not new. It had been there for at least a year, a hairline fracture that ran vertically down the center of the marker, caused by a thermal stress event that had occurred during one of Kale's 7 rare warm snaps, when the temperature had briefly risen above freezing for a single afternoon before crashing back down to lethal cold. The stone had expanded in the warmth and contracted in the cold, and the contraction had been too fast, too violent, for the stone's crystalline structure to absorb without damage, and a crack had formed. It was a small crack, barely visible, the kind of thing that a human walking past would not notice, and that even a careful observer would dismiss as insignificant, a natural weathering feature, nothing more, the kind of damage that every stone marker in every cemetery in every cold climate in the galaxy eventually developed. But the crack was not just in the stone. It went deeper. The crack extended from the surface of the marker down through the stone's full thickness, perhaps 10 centimeters of local rock, cut and set by hands that were not a mason's hands, and into the soil beneath. In the soil, it widened slightly, following a path of least resistance through the frozen earth, branching into secondary fractures the way a river delta branches into smaller channels as it approaches the sea. These secondary fractures spread outward in a rough circle, perhaps a meter in diameter, centered on the grave. They had not been there before. The grave had been excavated 3 years ago by the same hands that had carved the marker, two of Webb's colleagues, a man named Henriksen and a woman named Abadi, who had dug the hole with hand tools because the colony's small excavator had been damaged in the Screamer attack and there had been no time to repair it. They had dug to a depth of approximately 6 feet, placed the body, covered it with soil, and set the marker. It was a simple burial, unadorned, the kind of thing that happened when there was no priest and no funeral home and no embalming fluid, and you were working against the clock because the Screamer response protocol said you had to leave within the hour, and the grave was the last thing you owed a man before you abandoned his world. The soil they had used to fill the grave was the same soil that surrounded it, Kale 7 native permafrost, broken up by thermal picks and shoveled back into the hole in loose, uneven layers. It had settled over time, as soil does, compacting under its own weight and the weight of the marker. By the time Asha arrived, the grave surface was level with the surrounding ground, indistinguishable from the rest of the cemetery except for the marker. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The fractures that radiated outward from the base of the marker were not geological. They did not follow the natural fault lines in the permafrost. They did not conform to the patterns created by freeze-thaw cycles or hydrostatic pressure or any of the processes that normally shape the subsurface geometry of a frozen world. They were organic. Not in the sense of being caused by a living organism. There was no root system, no burrowing creature, no biological agent that could have created them. But in the sense of looking biological, of having the quality of growth rather than erosion, of expansion rather than collapse. They looked like veins. Thin, branching, interconnected veins that spread through the soil around the grave in a pattern that, if you stripped away the context and looked at it purely as geometry, bore a striking resemblance to the vascular network of a living tissue. Not a perfect resemblance, the lines were too straight in places, too angular, too obviously constrained by the crystalline structure of the frozen soil, but a resemblance nonetheless. The kind of resemblance that made a trained observer's breath catch in their throat, not because of what they were seeing, but because of what it implied. Something was growing down there. The rain found these fractures and followed them. It seeped into the narrow channels and ran downward, pulled by gravity and capillary action, traveling deeper into the soil than rain had any right to travel in ground that was frozen solid. It reached the fractures and the fractures accepted it, drawing it in, distributing it through the vein-like network with an efficiency that suggested the network was not merely passively receiving the water but actively directing it. And as the water moved through the fractures, it carried heat. Not much, the rain was cold, but it was warmer than the permafrost. Kale 7 rain fell at approximately -15 degrees, while the ground temperature at 6-foot depth was closer to -35. That 20-degree differential was tiny in absolute terms, meaningless for any practical purpose, incapable of thawing even a millimeter of frozen soil. But it was not nothing. And whatever was growing in the fractures around Marcus Webb's grave was not operating on scales that recognized the difference between something and nothing. Asha felt the rain reach the fractures. She felt it the way she felt everything, not as discrete sensory data points, but as a shift in the overall texture of the world, a change in the quality of the silence beneath her, a movement in the deep substrate of reality that her body processed as naturally as breathing. The fractures had been there before the rain. She had felt them growing slowly, imperceptibly over the course of days. They were part of what she was doing, part of the process that she had initiated when she lay down on the grave and reached into the earth with the invisible part of herself. She had not planned them. She had not willed them into existence in any conscious sense. They were simply happening the way roots happen when a seed is planted. Not because the seed decides to grow roots, but because growing roots is what seeds do, encoded in their deepest structure, inevitable as gravity. The fractures were roots. Not biological roots. Not made of cellulose or xylem or any material that a botanist would recognize. They were made of dragon of Asha, specifically of the substance of her being expressed in a form that human language had no adequate word for. They were extensions of her will, her presence, herself, propagated through the frozen ground around the grave the way a network propagates through a medium, following paths of least resistance, branching and rebranching, creating an infrastructure. An infrastructure for what? Asha could not have answered this question. She did not think in terms of infrastructure. She did not think in terms of purposes or functions or goals. She thought, if thought was even the right word, in terms of direction. There was a place she wanted to reach, and she was reaching toward it, and the reaching was creating the fractures, and the fractures were creating the infrastructure, and the infrastructure was doing something that she could feel but not describe. The rain helped. The water that seeped into the fractures carried a small amount of thermal energy, and the fractures conducted that energy downward, and at the bottom of the fractures, 6 feet below the surface, in the space where Marcus Webb's body had been placed 3 years ago, the temperature rose by a fraction of a degree. A fraction of a degree, in a space that was 35 degrees below zero. The change was so small that no instrument yet invented by human science could have detected it against the background noise of normal temperature fluctuation. But the pattern, the dispersed, scattered, incomplete pattern of Marcus Webb that Asha had been holding for 14 days, felt it. And the pattern shifted. Asha felt the shift. Her eyes opened. They had been closed for 14 days. The tissue around them was crusted with a thin layer of ice crystals that had formed from the condensation of her own breath, what little breath there was in her suspended state. Opening her eyes required her to break this crust, and she did so with a small, sharp movement of the muscles around her orbital sockets, sending a shower of tiny ice fragments tinkling against the stone beneath her. She blinked, once, twice. Her eyes adjusted to the gray light. The sky had not changed, still that flat, bone-white ceiling that KL7 offered in place of actual weather. The rain was still falling, still in its thin threads, still with the same patient, seeping persistence. Nothing in the external world had changed. Everything in the internal world had changed. Oshao lifted her head. The movement was slow, agonizingly slow, the kind of speed that a creature in deep torpor produces when it attempts to re-engage with physical reality. Her neck muscles, which had been holding the same position for 2 weeks, protested with a stiffness that was not pain exactly but something adjacent to it, a sensation of tissue that had forgotten how to move and was being forced to remember. Her head came up inch by inch, her unblinking eyes fixed on the stone beneath her. And as her head rose, her body followed, her front legs uncurling, her spine straightening, her hind legs pulling out from beneath her tail. She ended up in a position that was not quite standing and not quite crouching, something in between, a dragon's version of the way a human might rise from a deep sleep in a strange bed, uncertain of their surroundings, unsure of their own body's capabilities, every sense straining for information about what had changed while they were unconscious. Her ears rotated. The fin-like structures on either side of her skull, still small, still underdeveloped, but exquisitely sensitive, swiveled independently, scanning the soundscape of the cemetery with a precision that would have made a submarine sonar operator weep with envy. They registered the wind nor-northeast 12 kilometers per hour, consistent with KL7's standard atmospheric circulation. They registered the rain, uniform distribution, no localized anomalies. They registered the settling of the ground, normal thermal contraction, no seismic activity. And then they registered something else. A vibration. Small, so small that Asha's ears, which could detect the footstep of a mouse at 50 meters, almost missed it. It was not traveling through the air. It was traveling through the ground, through the stone beneath her feet, through the soil beneath the stone, through the frozen earth that separated her from whatever was below. She pressed her belly flat against the marker. This was not a conscious decision. It was instinct, the same instinct that made a dragon press its body against an egg it was incubating, maximizing surface contact to transfer heat, to feel the life inside, to monitor the heartbeat of the thing it was bringing into the world. Asha's body knew what to do even though Asha's mind did not understand what was happening. Her scales made contact with the cold stone, and the vibration traveled through the scales and into the sensory network beneath her skin and into her nervous system and into her brain. And her brain processed it and told her what it was. A rhythm. Not random, not geological, not the settling of earth or the trickle of water through soil or the expansion and contraction of frozen ground. A rhythm with a pattern with a structure that was unmistakably and irrefutably the structure of a heartbeat. Thump, a pause, thump thump, a pause, thump. Asha's breath stopped. Not metaphorically, physically. Her lungs, which had been drawing their shallow, infrequent breaths for 14 days, simply ceased their function. Her diaphragm locked in a position somewhere between inhalation and exhalation. Her body became absolutely still, not the stillness of torpor, which was a living stillness, a reduced but present state of biological activity, but the stillness of absolute attention, of every resource in her body being redirected to a single sensory channel. She listened. The heartbeat came again, and again, and again. Each repetition was identical to the last, the same interval between beats, the same slight double pulse in the middle of the pattern, the same long pause at the end. It was a metronomic rhythm, mechanical in its consistency, and yet somehow not mechanical at all, because mechanical rhythms were cold and this rhythm was warm, warm in a way that transcended temperature. Warm in the way that a voice you love is warm even when it is saying nothing. Warm in the way that presence is warm when it is the presence of the thing you have been reaching for in the dark. Ashan knew this heartbeats. She knew it the way she knew how to breathe. She knew it the way she knew the difference between herself and the stone beneath her. She knew it the way she knew that the sky was above and the ground was below and that the universe contained things worth existing for. She knew it because it was the first thing she had ever known. The rhythm that had surrounded her in the shell. The steady, unhurried pulse that had been her entire universe before she was born. The sound she had imprinted on in the darkness. The sound she had spent 3 months looking for. The sound that had stopped on a Wednesday afternoon when a man she had never met had put his body between a closing door and the end of everything. It was back. It was back. Asha made a sound. It was not a growl. It was not a hiss. It was not the angry squeal she had made at every handler who had tried to approach her in the 3 months of her life on Omega 9. It was not the contemptuous sound she made when she pushed nutrient packets away. It was not the song she had sung when she first found the grave. It was a keening, soft, desperate questioning. A sound that dragons, in all their ancient complexity across every world they had been found on, had only been documented making in the presence of one thing. Their own eggs. The keening of a dragon for its egg was one of the most thoroughly documented behaviors in xenobiology, not because it was common, but because it was so emotionally overwhelming to witness that every researcher who encountered it wrote about it at length, producing pages of description that all circled the same central truth without ever quite landing on it. The keening was a question, not are you alive? Dragons could determine that through other means, not are you safe? Safety was a human concern, not a dragon one. The question was deeper than either of those, more fundamental, more raw. The question was, are you in there? Not in the physical sense, in the real sense. In the sense that mattered, are you? Are the thing I am sensing the thing that I am looking for? Is the pattern I am feeling the pattern that I lost? Is it you, the specific and irreplaceable and singular you, or is it something else wearing your shape, something that has your rhythm but not your essence, something that is close but not close enough? Asha pressed her snout to the stone and keened the question into the grave. And beneath her, the heartbeat impossibly, unscientifically, against every known law of biology and death and thermodynamics and common sense, sped up. On Omega 9, 312 light-years away, Dr. Ananya Perk was standing in the doorway of Asha's empty enclosure when the alert came in. The enclosure had been empty for 5 days. The security team had tracked the drone's trajectory within hours of discovering Asha's escape, and the trajectory led unambiguously to KL7. Perk had known where Asha was going before the tracking analysis was complete. She had known the moment she saw the empty enclosure and the open locks and the direction the hatchling had taken through the station's corridors. She had known because she had spent 3 months studying Asha, and in 3 months she had learned more about that small gray dragon than she had learned about any subject in her entire career. And one of the things she had learned was that Asha's every action, from the food she refused to the direction she slept in, was oriented toward a single point in space. KL7, the grave, Marcus Webb. Perk had requested immediate retrieval. She had been denied. The reason for the denial was procedural, and it was, by the strict letter of the regulations, correct. KL7 was a screamer-contaminated world. Entry to screamer-contaminated worlds required Level 3 biohazard clearance, a minimum security detachment of 12 personnel, and authorization from a coalition planetary safety board that convened once a month and had, at its most recent meeting, declined to prioritize the retrieval of a single dragon hatchling from a dead colony when there were 17 active screamer incidents across the frontier that demanded attention. Perk had filed an appeal. The appeal had been placed in a queue. The queue had an estimated processing time of 6 to 8 weeks. She had then done something that was not strictly within regulations. She had contacted the supply division directly and asked about the automated drone schedule for KL7. She had learned that a drone had been prepped for launch on the day Asha escaped, the same drone that Asha had boarded, and that the drone had already arrived at KL7, deposited its cargo, and returned to Omega 9 on its automated turnaround cycle. She had learned that another drone was scheduled for launch in 3 days, a routine resupply run, carrying monitoring equipment and spare parts for the automated weather stations that the Coalition maintained on KL7 out of bureaucratic habit. She had requested that the drone be diverted to perform a visual scan of the cemetery. This request was also denied. Drones were programmed for specific tasks and could not be reprogrammed in flight without authorization from the Supply Division's Operations Committee, which met weekly and had already approved the current mission profile. Perk had then done something that was definitely not within regulations. She had gone to the drone's cargo bay before launch and had placed a small, unauthorized tracking device inside one of the equipment crates, a device of her own design that transmitted on a frequency not monitored by the station's communication systems. The device was not sophisticated. It could not transmit video or audio. It could only send a single data point, whether the drone had reached its destination, and if so, a rough estimate of ambient temperature at the landing site. The drone launched. 3 days later, the tracking device reported in. The drone had landed at KL 7. The ambient temperature at the landing site was negative 31 degrees Celsius. Normal, expected, unhelpful. Perk had gone back to the empty enclosure and stood in the doorway and stared at the shelf that Webb had built still there, bolted to the wall of the engine compartment, which was part of the shuttle and not part of the station, but which Perk had replicated and installed in the enclosure as a comfort object during Ashah's first weeks, an attempt to provide some continuity of environment that Ashah had completely ignored, and she had felt for the first time in her professional career. The specific and localized despair of a scientist who understood something important was happening and could not be there to observe it. That was where she was standing in the doorway of an empty enclosure, looking at a replica shelf that meant nothing, thinking about a baby dragon alone on a dead world when the alert came in. The alert was from the tracking device. Not a routine status update. The device was not programmed to send routine status updates. It was programmed to send a single transmission upon landing and then go silent. But it was transmitting now 5 days after landing, in direct contradiction of its programming, as if something had activated it, had turned it on and pointed it at something and said, "Pay attention to this." The transmission was not a data point, it was a waveform. Perk stared at the waveform on her personal terminal, a jagged, rhythmic pattern that repeated every 1.3 seconds with a consistency that no natural phenomenon could produce, and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It was a heartbeat. She moved faster than she had ever moved in her life. The next 90 minutes were a blur of actions that Perk would later be unable to recall in sequential order. She remembered fragments, the feel of her palm hitting the comm button in the station commander's office, the sound of her own voice using words like vital sign and unambiguous. And you need to authorize this now. The look on Commander H-Su's face as he stared at the waveform on her terminal and slowly removed his glasses and cleaned them and put them back on and stared again. The way people do when the thing they are seeing does not fit into any category their brain has prepared for it. She remembered the argument. HSU saying that a single anomalous transmission from an unauthorized device did not constitute sufficient evidence to mount a retrieval mission to a screamer-contaminated world. Perk saying that the waveform was not anomalous, it was specific. It was a heartbeat with a 1.3-second cycle and a double pulse pattern that was consistent with human cardiac rhythm and inconsistent with every known geological or meteorological phenomenon on KL 7. HSU saying that the device could be malfunctioning, could be picking up interference from the weather stations, could be doing anything other than what she was claiming it was doing. Perk saying that the device was her design and it did not malfunction and it could not pick up interference on that frequency, and that he could either authorize the mission or she would take a shuttle herself without authorization. And he could explain to the safety board why a senior xenobiologist had been allowed to commandeer a vehicle, because he had been too cautious to approve a properly staffed retrieval. She did not remember exactly how the authorization came through. She remembered H-Su's face changing, not softening exactly but shifting. The way a face shifts when a person moves from "this is against protocol" to "this is against protocol, but I will find a way to make it not against protocol because the alternative is worse." She remembered him picking up his comm unit and making a call and using phrases like "extraordinary circumstances" and "potential first contact level biological event," and "I am taking personal responsibility for this decision." She remembered the two security officers. Officer Brennan, who was tall and quiet, and had the look of someone who had seen things on frontier assignments that had rearranged his understanding of what was possible, and had come out the other side with a professional calm that was more unsettling than any amount of panic would have been. Officer Rivas, who was shorter and louder, and had been assigned to Omega-9 as a disciplinary transfer after an incident on a different station that nobody talked about, and who spent the entire pre-launch briefing asking questions that were clearly designed to establish that this mission was stupid and dangerous, and above his pay grade. She remembered the shuttle, a small, fast reconnaissance vessel called the Corex, designed for quick in-and-out operations, not comfort. It had 4 seats, a minimal medical bay, and a cargo hold that was currently empty except for the equipment Perk had loaded. A portable scanner, a full xenobiological field kit, thermal blankets, nutrient packs designed for dragon metabolism, a sedative rifle that she hoped she would not need to use, and a small recorder that she intended to use to document everything. She remembered the jump, the disorienting lurch of faster-than-light transit, the way the stars smeared into lines and then collapsed back into points, the silence that fell inside the shuttle during the transit that was not really silence but the absence of anything to hear, the specific loneliness of being between places, in the nowhere that existed between where you had been and where you were going. She remembered arriving at Kale 7, the planet filling the viewport, a sphere of white and gray and blue-white, unremarkable, the kind of planet that survey teams skipped over because there was nothing to see. The cold radiating from it even at orbital distance, a thermal signature that was less a temperature than an attitude, a statement of intent. I do not want you here, I have never wanted you here, I will never want you here. She remembered the descent. The thin atmosphere grabbing at the shuttle, the ice crystals rattling against the hull, the landscape rising up to meet them, flat, white, featureless, the colony a cluster of dark shapes on the horizon that grew slowly larger as the shuttle descended. And then they were over it, and then they were past it, and then they were descending toward the southern edge where the cemetery was, and Perk was pressing her face against the viewport and saying, there, that cluster of stones, that's it. She remembered the landing. Hard because the ground was uneven and the shuttle's autopilot was not designed for precision touchdowns on unprepared surfaces. The skis hitting frozen ground with a jolt that rattled her teeth, the engines winding down, the silence that followed, total and absolute, the silence of a world with no living things in it, no birds, no insects, no wind in leaves because there were no leaves, just the endless flat whisper of air moving over ice. She remembered the door opening, the cold hitting her like a wall, not the controlled cold of a station environment, not the theoretical cold of a temperature reading on a screen, but the real cold, the cold that had teeth and weight and malice, the cold that said you are a warm thing and I am going to fix that. Her breath freezing on her lips, her eyes watering, her fingers going numb inside her gloves within seconds despite the thermal lining. She remembered walking. The cemetery was 200 meters from the shuttle. It took 4 minutes to reach it. 4 minutes of slogging through a thin crust of snow over frozen ground, her boots slipping on the ice, her body already losing heat faster than her suit could replace it, Rivas behind her cursing in 2 languages, Brennan beside her silent and watchful, his eyes moving constantly, scanning the horizon for threats that were not there because the screamers were gone and the only danger on this planet was the planet itself. She remembered seeing the grave. The marker was visible from 20 meters away, a rough rectangle of stone rising from the dead grass, its surface darkened by the rain, the misspelled name just barely legible in the gray light. And on the marker, lying with her body pressed flat against the stone, her snout touching the carved letters, her eyes open and fixed on something that Perk could not see, was a Sha. She was alive. Perk stopped walking. Brennan stopped beside her. Rivas stopped behind them and said something that might have been a question but that Perk did not hear because she was looking at a Sha and a Sha was looking at the grave and the world had contracted to a point that contained only those 2 things, a small gray dragon and a stone with a dead man's name on it, and everything else was background noise, irrelevant, a distraction from the thing that was actually happening. A Sha did not look up. This was the most significant thing about the scene, and Perk knew it immediately, with a certainty that came from 3 months of studying this creature's behavior and learning to read the language of her body. A Sha did not look up when 3 humans approached her position. A Sha did not hiss, did not growl, did not make any aggressive or defensive gesture. A Sha did not acknowledge their presence in any way. A Sha had never done this before, not once, not for anyone. In 3 months of captivity on Omega-9, a Sha had reacted to every human who came within her visual range with some form of rejection, attack, withdrawal, contempt, dismissal. She had never simply ignored a human. She had never been so focused on something else that a human presence did not register as a stimulus requiring a response. She was ignoring them now. She was ignoring them because they did not matter. What mattered was beneath her. What mattered was the stone and the soil and the thing she could feel through both. The thing that was beating, the thing that was there, the thing that she had been holding for 14 days and that had just impossibly answered. Perk approached slowly. Step by step, each foot placed carefully on the frozen ground, her breathing shallow and controlled, her hands open at her sides in the universal gesture of non-threat. She was not afraid of a Sha. She had never been afraid of a Sha, even when the hatchling had bitten her, even when she had seen the damage those small teeth could do to the enclosure walls. But she was aware that she was walking into a situation she did not understand, and she had enough respect for the unknown to move through it carefully. She reached the grave. She stood at the foot of the marker and looked down at a Sha, and a Sha looked at the stone, and between them was a distance of perhaps 30 centimeters that felt like a distance measured in something other than centimeters. A Sha was vibrating. Not trembling, trembling was involuntary, a sign of fear or cold or weakness. This was vibration, deliberate, controlled. Her whole body was producing a low-frequency oscillation that Perk could feel in her own chest when she stood close enough, a hum that resonated through the frozen ground and up through her boots and into her bones. It was the same frequency as the keening Asha had made when she first found the grave, that soft, desperate, questioning sound, but sustained, continuous, not a call and response, but a transmission. A signal being sent downward into the earth, into whatever was below. Perk knelt. She knelt on the frozen ground beside the grave, her knees pressing into the dead grass, the cold immediately biting through the fabric of her suit. She leaned close to the stone, close enough to see the details that were invisible from a standing distance, the tiny cracks in the marker's surface, the way the rain had pooled in these cracks and was being absorbed rather than running off, the faint discoloration of the stone around the cracks, a grayish-blue tinge that was not natural to the local geology. She put her hand on the stone. It was warm. Not warm the way a heated surface is warm. Warm the way a body is warm. Warm with the specific, unmistakable quality of biological heat, generated from within, maintained against external conditions, the kind of warmth that said something alive is on the other side of this. The stone was 4 inches thick. Beneath the stone was 6 feet of frozen soil. Beneath the soil was a dead man. The stone was warm. Perk's hand began to shake. She pressed it flat against the marker, spreading her fingers wide, maximizing contact, and she felt the warmth spread beneath her palm like a puddle. And she felt the vibration that Asha was producing travel through the stone and into her hand and up her arm and into her chest. And she felt, or thought she felt, or imagined she felt, or was told by some part of her brain that processed things the conscious mind could not handle, a second vibration beneath the first. A rhythm. Thump pause thump pause thump. Oh, Perk said, the word came out very small. It came out of a place in her that was not professional, not scientific, not any of the things she was supposed to be in this moment. It came out of the place where she kept the things she was not supposed to feel, the wonder, the terror, the fragile, reckless hope that had no place in a scientist's toolkit but that she had never been able to fully excise. Oh my God. Dr. Perk, Brennan's voice behind her, controlled but with an edge. What are you seeing? She did not answer immediately. She could not answer immediately. She was pressing her hand against a warm stone on a frozen planet and feeling a heartbeat that should not exist, and her mind was running through every explanation, every rationalization, every possible alternative interpretation of the data her senses were delivering, and every single one of them was failing. Get the digging equipment, she said. Ma'am, we don't know what's down there. I don't care what's down there, get the equipment now. A long pause. She heard Riva's shift behind her, heard the creak of his boots on the frozen ground, heard the wind move across the cemetery with its thin, cold voice. Officer Brennan, she said, and she did not take her hand off the stone, and she did not take her eyes off Asha, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had spent her entire career preparing for a moment she had not believed would actually come and who was now, in that moment, discovering that preparation and reality were not the same thing. There is a heartbeat under this grave. I can feel it. The dragon can feel it. We are going to find out what it is. If you have a problem with that, you can stay on the shuttle and I will dig it up myself with my bare hands. But we are going to dig it up. Do you understand? Brennan understood. He always understood. That was the thing about Brennan, he did not need explanations. He needed to know whether the person giving the order believed what they were saying. And Perk believed what she was saying with every cell in her body, with every fiber of her training, with every instinct that had led her into xenobiology in the first place, because she had always known, had always in the deepest and most private part of herself known, that the universe was stranger and more beautiful and more terrifying than the models allowed. Rivas, Brennan said, get the shovels. They dug by hand at first. The shovels were compact emergency tools from the shuttle's kit, short-handled, foldable, designed for clearing debris from around a disabled vehicle, not for excavation. They were not adequate for the task. The ground was frozen solid, and each shovelful required significant effort to break free, and the effort produced minimal results, a chip of ice here, a fragment of soil there, a slow and frustrating accumulation of removed material that seemed to shrink rather than grow as the hole they were creating refilled with wind-blown snow almost as fast as they could empty it. Brennan dug, Rivas dug, cursing steadily in a mixture of standard and what Perk thought might be Tagalog but was too profane to identify with certainty. Perk dug with her bare hands. She had pulled off her gloves because they were limiting her dexterity, and because the cold, paradoxically focused her, gave her something to fight against that was simpler and more immediate than the enormity of what she was doing. The soil was loose. This was wrong, it should not have been loose. The ground on Kale 7 was permafrost, continuous, unbroken, frozen to a depth of hundreds of meters. A grave dug 3 years ago should have been as solid as the surrounding terrain, the backfilled soil having frozen and consolidated into a matrix that was, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from undisturbed ground. But the soil they were removing was loose. Not thawed, it was still cold, still frozen in the sense that ice crystals were present in its structure. but loose, granular, almost friable, as if something had disrupted its crystalline matrix from below and prevented it from reconsolidating. As if something had been pushing up. Perk noticed this after the first 30 minutes. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of small observations that coalesced into a realization. The soil was too easy to move. The shovels were encountering less resistance than they should have. The fragments breaking away from the walls of the hole were not the hard, angular chunks that frozen permafrost typically produced, but softer, rounder pieces that seemed almost to have been separated from the surrounding matrix rather than broken from it. She said nothing, she kept digging, but she filed the observation away, adding it to the growing list of anomalies that this grave was producing, and she felt the list pressing against the walls of her professional composure like water against a dam. Osha watched him. She had not moved from the grave marker. When the digging began, she had shifted her position slightly, pulling her front legs back, giving the diggers room to work but staying on the stone, staying in contact with it, maintaining the transmission that she had been maintaining for hours. Her eyes followed the shovels as they rose, and she made the keening sound continuously, a low, steady hum that filled the cemetery with a tone that was almost below the threshold of human hearing, but that was nonetheless present, a constant background vibration that Perk could feel in her teeth and in the bones of her skull. She was directing them, not with gestures or cues, with the sound. The keening was not random. It varied in intensity and pitch as the diggers worked, rising when they were on the right track, falling when they veered off, creating a crude but effective guidance system that Brennan noticed first and Rivas noticed second, and neither of them commented on because they did not have the vocabulary for what they were experiencing. They dug for 2 hours. The hole grew a meter deep, a meter and a half, 2 meters. The soil continued to be loose, continued to come away with an ease that defied the ambient temperature and the known properties of KL7 permafrost. The walls of the hole were stable, not collapsing, not slumping, held in place by something that was not structural support in any conventional sense, but that was functionally equivalent to it, as if the soil itself had been arranged to maintain the integrity of the excavation. At the 2-meter mark, the soil changed. It became darker. Not much. A subtle shift from the pale gray of KL7 native earth to something slightly warmer, slightly richer, with a hint of organic content that should not have been present in a grave that had been dug in mineral soil with no biological material mixed in. And it became warmer, not dramatically, not enough to thaw, but enough for Perk to feel the difference through her bare hands when she touched the walls of the hole. A shift from painfully cold to cold but not painful, as if the ground itself was being heated from below. At the 3-foot mark, Brennan hit something that was not soil. His shovel struck it with a sound that was not the dull clang of metal on frozen earth but a softer, wetter sound, a sound like impact against living tissue, against something that gave slightly before resisting, that yielded and then bounced back, that had resilience in it. Brennan pulled his shovel back and looked at the edge and saw, clinging to the metal, a thin film of something that was not soil and not ice and not anything he could identify. It was pale gray, slightly translucent, veined with something that glowed. Faintly, so faintly that it was almost invisible in the gray light of KL7 sky. But it was glowing, a soft blue luminescence that pulsed in time with a rhythm that Brennan could feel in his fingertips even after he had wiped the material off the shovel blade. "Ma'am," he said, his voice was very steady, his face was not. "I need you to see this." Perk climbed out of the hole. It was deep enough now that she had to brace her arms on the rim and pull herself up, her frozen fingers slipping on the icy edge, and walked around to where Brennan was standing. She looked at the substance on his shovel. She looked at the wall of the hole where he had struck it. She looked at a Shah who was still keening, whose eyes were now fixed on the exposed section of the membrane with an intensity that made Perk think of a mother watching her child take its first steps. "Oh," Perk said again. It was the same word she had said before. It was the only word that seemed adequate. She climbed back into the hole. She approached the membrane carefully, her hands out, her fingers spread. She touched it. It was warm, not the warmth of the stone. This was a different quality of warmth, more active, more deliberate, like the warmth of a fever rather than the warmth of a blanket. It pulsed under her touch, the blue veins brightening momentarily at the point of contact and then fading back to their baseline glow. It was soft, yielding to the pressure of her fingers with a smoothness that was not like any biological tissue she had ever touched, more like silk or like the surface of a still pool of water, something that gave without tearing and then recovered without creasing. It was organic. She knew this without needing to run a scan. The way it responded to her touch, the way the veins tracked her fingers as she moved them across the surface, the way it seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow rhythm that was not the heartbeat beneath it but was related to it, a secondary rhythm, a respiratory rhythm, as if the membrane itself was a lung, all of it said organic in a voice that could not be mistaken. It was dragon tissue. She knew this the way she knew her own name. The quality of the warmth, the pattern of the veining, the specific texture of the surface. She had spent 3 months studying HFY's scales, her skin, the membranes of her crumpled wings. She had run her scanner over every millimeter of the hatchling's body during the weeks of attempted bonding. She knew dragon tissue the way a dermatologist knows skin, the way a botanist knows leaves, the way a poet knows the sound of their own language spoken by a native speaker. This was dragon tissue. It was HFY's tissue. It had the same genetic signature, the same cellular structure, the same impossible warmth. HFY had grown this. A baby dragon, barely 4 months old, isolated and starving and alone on a dead world, had generated a living membrane, a sheet of organic material that was, by Perk's rough estimate, at least 3 meters in diameter, and had wrapped it around the contents of Marcus Webb's grave. And beneath it, visible through the semi-translucent tissue, was a shape. Human-shaped. Perk's hand trembled on the membrane. She pressed her face closer, her nose almost touching the surface, and peered through the translucent gray tissue into the cavity below. The blue veins cast a faint light that illuminated the interior in patches, creating a patchwork of visibility and shadow, like looking into a foggy room through a window smeared with Vaseline. But the shape was clear. Head, shoulders, arms, the line of a torso, the bend of knees. A human body, curled in a fetal position, suspended in the center of the membrane-enclosed cavity like an embryo in a womb. It was not a skeleton, it was not a decomposed body, it was not a mummified remains. It was intact, whole, complete. The skin was pale, paler than any living person's skin should be, almost translucent itself, with a blue-white quality that suggested it had not seen sunlight in a very long time. But it was skin, not leather, not desiccated tissue, not the waxy shell of a corpse preserved by cold. It was skin with pores and texture and the subtle variation in color that comes from blood vessels beneath the surface. And the blood vessels were visible. They traced patterns beneath the translucent skin, not human patterns, dragon patterns. The same blue-veined luminescence that marked the membrane was present in the network of vessels beneath the body's skin, as if HFY's tissue had not merely wrapped around the body but had integrated with it, growing into the spaces between cells, creating a hybrid vascular system that was neither fully human nor fully dragon but something that had elements of both. Perk pulled back from the membrane. She pressed her hands to her face. Her fingers were shaking so badly that she could feel them tapping against her cheekbones like small, frantic birds. "Keep digging," she said. Her voice was muffled by her hands. "Keep digging, we need to get him out." "Dr. Perk," Rivas said, and for the first time since they had landed, his voice was not sarcastic or complaining. It was quiet. It was the voice of a man who was looking at something that was rearranging his understanding of what was real, and who was handling it by asking the question that his training had prepared him to ask in situations where reality stopped making sense. "What is that?" Perk lowered her hands. She looked at Rivas. She looked at Brennan. She looked at HFY, who was still on the stone above them, still keening, still watching, and whose eyes, enormous, dark, ancient, were fixed on the membrane with an expression that Perk had never seen on a dragon's face before and that she recognized instantly despite never having seen it, because it was not a dragon expression. It was a human expression. It was hope. "That," Perk said, "is a dragon egg." It took another 45 minutes to excavate the full extent of the membrane. It was larger than Perk's initial estimate, much larger. As they dug outward and downward following the edges of the organic structure, it became clear that the membrane did not merely cover the grave, it replaced it. The original burial, 6 feet of soil covering a human body in a rectangular hole, was gone. In its place was a roughly spherical cavity, perhaps 4 meters in diameter, lined entirely with the pale gray, blue-veined tissue. The cavity was not perfectly round. It bulged in places, contracted in others, had folds and creases that gave it an organic, almost visceral quality, like the interior of a stomach or a lung. But it was enclosed, sealed, a self-contained environment separated from the frozen earth around it by a wall of living dragon tissue. The membrane was anchored to the surrounding soil by the vein-like fractures that Perk had detected on the surface, the ones she had seen radiating outward from the base of the grave marker. These fractures were not cracks in the ground. They were roots, extensions of the membrane that had grown outward through the permafrost, drawing heat from the soil, drawing moisture, drawing whatever resources were available in a frozen wasteland, and channeling them back to the central cavity where they were used to maintain the environment inside. It was, Perk realized, a life support system. A crude one, a desperate one, built by a creature with no tools, no technology, no understanding of the principles involved, operating purely on instinct and the strange, unnamed force that dragons carried inside them. It was not efficient. It was not elegant. It was the biological equivalent of a person building a shelter out of wreckage after a shipwreck, clumsy, improvised, held together by will more than skill, but functional, doing the thing it needed to do, keeping the thing inside it alive. Or more precisely, bringing the thing inside it back. Because Marcus Webb had been dead, the records were clear on this. The rescue team that had arrived after the Kestrel launched had found his body at the shuttle's cargo bay door. They had confirmed death, no pulse, no brain activity, significant cranial trauma consistent with screamer attack. They had not recovered the remains because of active screamer presence, but they had documented the condition, and the documentation was unambiguous. Dead. And now, 3 years later, wrapped in a cocoon of dragon tissue on a frozen planet at the edge of nowhere, he had a heartbeat. Perk knelt at the edge of the excavation and stared at the membrane and thought about dragons. She thought about everything she knew, everything anyone knew, about the species that appeared on worlds where they had no evolutionary right to exist, that bonded with species they had never encountered, that did things that broke the rules of every scientific framework applied to them. She thought about the theories, adaptive anomaly, reality-indexed biology, ontological persistence, and how none of them were adequate, how none of them captured the thing that dragons actually were, which was something that could not be captured by theories because it existed in a space that theories could not reach. She thought about Asha, 4 months old, a baby, alone on a dead world with no food and no warmth and no reason to survive, and yet surviving, and not just surviving but doing this, building a cocoon around a dead man's body, growing it from her own substance, draining herself nearly to death in the process. All because she had imprinted on a heartbeat before she was born and she could not accept that the heartbeat had stopped. It was not science, it was not biology, it was not any of the categories that Perk had spent her career building. It was love. Not human love. Not the love that humans felt with all its complexities and neuroses and cultural overlays. Something purer, something older, something that existed before language and before thought and before the first cell divided into two and decided that being alive was a thing worth doing. A love that did not need a name because it predated names. A love that did not need a reason because it predated reasons. A love that was simply there, embedded in the deepest structure of a species that had been doing impossible things since before humans learned to light fires. Asha loved Marcus Webb, and Asha had decided that love was a good enough reason to bring him back from the dead. Dr. Perk Brennan said he was standing at the edge of the hole holding a shovel, looking down at the membrane with an expression that, on his normally featureless face, qualified as emotional upheaval. How do you want to proceed? Perk looked at the membrane. She looked at the shape inside it, the curled human form, the pale skin, the blue vein luminescence that was not human but that was keeping something human alive in a way that human medicine could not. She looked at Asha, still on the stone above, still keening, still watching, and she understood something that she would spend the rest of her career trying to express and never fully succeed in expressing, which was that what she was about to do was not a scientific procedure. It was an act of faith. Carefully, she said, we open it carefully. The membrane ruptured on its own. They had been planning to make a controlled incision. Perk had a surgical scalpel in her field kit, and she had been considering the best angle of approach, the location that would cause the least damage to both the membrane and its contents, the technique that would maximize the chances of whatever was inside surviving the transition to an external environment. She had been thinking about it in scientific terms, angles, pressures, tissue densities, risk factors. Because that was how she thought, that was how she had been trained to think, that was the framework she used to make sense of a universe that did not always make sense. The membrane did not wait for her to finish thinking. It tore. Not violently, not with the explosive force of a ruptured pressure vessel or the sudden release of a contained fluid. It tore the way a flower opens, slowly, gracefully, with a sense of inevitability that made it seem less like a structural failure and more like a completion. As if this was the thing the membrane had been building toward from the moment Asha first pressed her belly against the stone and reached down into the earth. The tear ran vertically, from the top of the cavity to the bottom, following a line that was not straight but curved, a gentle arc that bisected the membrane with the precision of a surgical incision despite being produced by no scalpel and no hand. The two halves of the membrane peeled apart, folding back on themselves like curtains being drawn, revealing the interior of the cavity in a single sweeping motion that took perhaps 5 seconds and felt like 5 hours. And what poured out was not blood, not fluid, not any of the substances that a biologist would expect to find inside an organic enclosure that had been maintaining a living environment for 3 years. Light. Warm, golden, so bright that Perk threw her arm over her eyes and Brennan staggered backward and Rivas swore and dropped his shovel. It filled the excavation and spilled out over the rim and illuminated the cemetery in a wash of amber that turned the gray sky and the white ground and the dark stone markers into a tableau that belonged in a religious text rather than a scientific report. It was not harsh, it did not hurt to look at, not once the initial shock passed, but it was intense. A light that seemed to carry weight and texture and temperature that fell on the skin like warm water that filled the air like a sound you could feel in your chest. Oshao leapt. She leapt from the grave marker, a distance of perhaps 1.5 meters, which was farther than her small, underdeveloped wings should have been able to propel her, and landed in the excavation with a grace that was startling in a creature that had spent the last 2 weeks motionless. She landed on the torn edge of the membrane and from there dove into the cavity, disappearing into the golden light with a splash that was not a splash because there was no liquid, just a wave of luminance that rippled outward as her small body entered it. Brennan shouted, "Oshao." Perk did not shout, she did not move. She stood at the edge of the excavation with her arm still raised over her eyes and she watched, because what she was seeing did not fit any threat response she had ever been trained for, and the absence of a known threat response was itself a form of information. And Perk was, above all things, a person who paid attention to information. Oshao was burrowing. Through the light, through the membrane, through whatever substance filled the interior of the cavity, the hatchling was pushing forward with her front legs, her hind legs paddling for purchase, her small body wriggling with the undulating motion of a creature born to move through medium, water, air, something else. She was not struggling. She was not panicked. She was working with the same steady, unhurried efficiency that she had inherited from a man she had never met, the same reliability, the same refusal to be hurried by circumstances. She reached the body. Perk saw it happen, saw Asha's small gray form emerge from the light and make contact with the curled human shape at the center of the cavity. The hatchling pushed her head against the body's shoulder, braced her front legs against its chest, and pulled. The body moved. Not much, not dramatically. A shift, a settling, a change in the quality of stillness that differentiated a thing that is not moving because it cannot move from a thing that is not moving because it has not yet started moving. The body shifted, and then it shifted again, and then a hand emerged from the golden light. Human, calloused. A maintenance technician's hand with a scar across the knuckle from a wrench slip. Perk had read the file, she knew about the scar. She had noted it as an identifying marker in case the remains were ever recovered. And the fingers were opening and closing, flexing, testing the air with small, tentative movements that were achingly familiar to anyone who had ever watched a newborn baby discover its own hands. The hand flexed once, twice. Then an arm, a shoulder, a head. Marcus Webb surfaced from his own grave like a man breaking through water. His eyes were open, wide, unseeing, pupil-dilated, the eyes of a person waking from a sleep so deep that the boundary between sleep and death had been blurred beyond recognition. His mouth was open. He was gasping, not the dramatic, cinema-style gasp of someone returning from the dead in a holovid, but a real gasp, a weak, ragged, insufficient intake of air that suggested his lungs had forgotten how to work and were being forced to remember in real time. His skin was pale, almost blue-white in the golden light, and the dragon vein patterns were visible beneath it. A network of luminescent blue lines that traced paths across his forearms and up his neck and across his temples, fading as Perk watched, dimming from bright blue to faint blue to a ghostly trace that was barely visible before disappearing entirely. He was naked, his body was intact, not decayed, not preserved, not the waxy shell of a corpse. Alive. His chest rose and fell with the ragged breathing. His pulse was visible in his throat, strong and steady despite the arrhythmia that Perk could see in the slightly uneven intervals between the beats of the blood vessel. Oshao wrapped herself around his neck. She was too small to wrap around a human neck. Her body was the size of a large cat, her legs barely long enough to reach halfway around his throat. But she wrapped herself as far as she could, pressing her scales against his skin, tucking her head under his jaw, and she keened directly into his ear, not the questioning keening of before but something else, something that had an entirely different quality, something that was not a question but an answer. "You are here, you are back, I held on, I held on, I held on." Marcus Webb blinked. His eyes focused. Not quickly, the focusing was a process, a gradual sharpening of the blur, like a telescope being adjusted by someone who was not sure which direction to turn the knob. The golden light was fading, draining out of the cavity and back into the membrane, which was already beginning to collapse inward, its structural integrity dissipating now that its function was complete. In the fading light, Webb's eyes found Asha first. The small gray dragon pressed against his throat, her dark eyes inches from his face. He looked at her for a long time. Then his eyes moved past her, past the edge of the excavation, past the stone markers of the cemetery, past the dead colony and the frozen ground and the gray sky, to the three humans who were standing at the edge of the hole looking down at him with expressions that ranged from horror to disbelief to something that was, in Perk's case, closer to religious awe than she would ever be comfortable admitting. "Hi," he said. His voice was raw, ruined. The voice of a man whose vocal cords had not vibrated in 3 years, who was producing sound for the first time since a Wednesday afternoon when the world ended, and he had held a door shut with his body and said 2 words to a woman he barely knew through a gap that was too small for his fingers. He said, "I think I've been asleep." It took 45 minutes to get him out of the grave. 45 minutes that Perk would later remember in fragments, each one sharp and isolated, like photographs pulled from a fire, not a sequence but a collection, unordered, each one burning with its own specific intensity. She remembered Brennan jumping into the hole. He moved without hesitation, without the caution that protocol demanded, without any of the professional distance that a security officer was supposed to maintain in an unknown situation. He hit the bottom of the excavation and sank to his knees in the remnants of the membrane, which was already degrading, the pale gray tissue dissolving into something that was not quite liquid and not quite vapor, a fine mist that rose from the cavity and dissipated in the cold air like breath on a winter morning. He reached Marcus Webb with 3 long strides and put his hands on the man's shoulders and steadied him. And Webb leaned into the contact with the unself-conscious gratitude of someone who had been alone in the dark for a very long time and had forgotten what it felt like to be touched. She remembered Rivas at the edge of the hole, frozen, his shovel still on the ground where he had dropped it, his face doing something that she could not quite name, not fear, not revulsion, not wonder, but some combination of all three that his features could not resolve into a single expression. So they simply cycled through them one after another like a slot machine that could not decide where to stop. His mouth was open. It had been open since the light poured out of the membrane, and he had not closed it since, and a thin line of saliva connected his lower lip to his chin, and he did not seem to notice or care. She remembered herself. She remembered standing at the edge of the hole and feeling the golden light on her face as it faded, feeling it warm her skin and then depart. And she remembered the specific quality of its departure, not like a light being turned off but like a presence withdrawing. A consciousness deciding that it was no longer needed and receding into whatever dimension presences receded into when they were done. She remembered the cold rushing back in to fill the space the light had left. And she remembered that the cold felt different after the light, harsher, more hostile, more real, as if the light had been a temporary amendment to the laws of physics, and its removal was a reminder that the laws were still in effect and they were not kind. She remembered Asha. Asha did not leave Webb's side during the extraction. When Brennan lifted Webb from the cavity, one arm under his shoulders, one under his knees, raising him with the careful strength of a man who was trained to carry injured people through dangerous environments, and who understood that the person he was carrying was not injured but was something else. Something for which there was no training and no protocol. Asha clung to Webb's neck with all 4 legs and her tail wrapped around his collarbone and her face pressed into the hollow of his throat. And she made a sound that was not the keening and not the purr and not anything Perk had ever heard a dragon make. It was a humming, low, continuous, variable in pitch, rising and falling in a pattern that was not random but was also not any melody or rhythm that Perk could identify. It was the sound of a creature communicating in a language that had no words because it did not need words, a language of pure emotional transmission, a sound that meant I am here, I am not leaving, you are not alone, I am here, I am here, I am here. Webb's hand, the scarred hand, the maintenance technician's hand, the hand that had held a dragon egg against his chest for 8 kilometers through a frozen wind, rose slowly, trembling with the weakness of muscles that had not moved in 3 years, and came to rest on Asha's back. His fingers curled around her body, not gripping, just resting, and the humming changed, shifted in some quality that Perk could hear but not describe, a brightening or a deepening, as if the contact had completed a circuit that had been open for 3 years and was now finally closed. Brennan carried Webb to the shuttle. Perk walked beside them, close enough to monitor, far enough to give them space. Rivas walked behind, his shovel still on the ground beside the grave, abandoned because he had not thought to pick it up and because nobody had reminded him and because the shovel did not matter anymore. Nothing that had mattered before the light poured out of the ground mattered anymore. The categories had changed. The filing system had been burned. Everything was being resorted according to a new set of principles that nobody had seen yet, and nobody understood. The shuttle's medical bay was small, 2 beds, basic diagnostic equipment, a supply cabinet stocked for minor injuries and routine illness, not for the resuscitation of a man who had been clinically dead for 3 years. They laid Webb on the nearer bed and wrapped him in thermal blankets because he was shivering, not the violent, uncontrollable shivering of hypothermia but a finer tremor, a vibration at the cellular level, as if his body was recalibrating itself to the experience of being alive and was producing small errors as it went. Asha would not leave his side. She curled on the bed beside him, still pressed against his throat, still humming, and when Perk tried to gently move her to run a scanner over Webb's neck, Asha's lips peeled back from her teeth in a way that was very clear and very final. Perk moved her scanner to a different part of Webb's body and did not try to move Asha again. The scans were wrong. Not wrong in the way that broken equipment produces wrong readings. The scanner was functioning perfectly, its calibration was within normal parameters, and the data it produced was internally consistent. The readings were wrong in the way that a photograph of a unicorn would be wrong, not because the camera malfunctioned, but because the thing it was capturing did not conform to any category the camera's software had been designed to process. Marcus Webb's body temperature was 39.2 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees above the human baseline. Not dangerously high, not fever range, but high enough to be notable, high enough that the scanner flagged it as an anomaly and suggested possible infection or inflammation as a cause. There was no infection, there was no inflammation. His white blood cell count was normal. His inflammatory markers were within standard ranges. The temperature was coming from somewhere else, not from his immune system but from him, from his tissue itself, as if his body had been recalibrated to operate at a slightly higher set point and was maintaining that set point with the calm precision of a thermostat. There was bioluminescence in his skin, faint, so faint that it was only visible in the darkened medical bay with the overhead lights turned off. A network of blue-white lines tracing paths across his forearms, his shoulders, his chest, his neck. They were the same patterns that Perk had seen beneath his skin when he was still inside the membrane, the dragon vein patterns, the hybrid vascular network that Asha's tissue had created. But they were fading. As Perk watched, the lines dimmed, their luminescence decreasing by imperceptible degrees, the blue shifting toward white and then toward nothing, until the only remaining trace was on his forearms, where two thin lines, one on each arm, following the path of the radial artery, glowed with a faintness that was more memory than light. His heartbeat was strong, 72 beats per minute, steady, but slightly off rhythm, a subtle arrhythmia that was not quite a murmur and not quite a skip but something in between, a hesitation between the second and third beat of each cycle that gave his pulse a distinctive cadence. Perk listened to it with a stethoscope and recognized it immediately, and the recognition made her eyes sting because it was the rhythm she had heard on the tracking device's transmission, the rhythm that had brought her to this planet, the rhythm that Asha had been keening over for hours in the rain. It was not a human rhythm, not entirely. It was a human rhythm with a dragon undertone, a heartbeat that had been rebuilt using two sets of blueprints, a hybrid organ that was neither one thing nor the other but something new, something that had never existed before and that the scanner's diagnostic software could not classify because there was no category for human-dragon hybrid cardiac tissue in its database. His brain was active. This was, in Perk's professional assessment, the most wrong thing of all. Marcus Webb had been dead for 3 years. Dead, no blood flow, no oxygenation, no metabolic activity. A human brain deprived of oxygen for more than 6 minutes suffered irreversible damage. A brain deprived for 3 years should have been liquefied, autolyzed, reduced to a mass of degraded protein and lipid that bore no structural resemblance to the organ it had once been. Webb's brain was intact, not just intact, active. The scanner showed normal neural activity across all regions, motor cortex, prefrontal cortex, temporal lobes, cerebellum, brainstem, with firing patterns that were consistent with a living, functioning brain. There was no evidence of hypoxic damage, no scarring, no atrophy. The organ had been preserved, not in the way that cold preserves tissue, which is a static preservation, a holding pattern, a suspension of decay, but actively preserved, maintained at a functional level by the dragon tissue that had infiltrated its vascular network and sustained it with whatever dragons used instead of blood. His memories were intact. She could not verify this with the scanner. There was no imaging technology that could map the content of memories, but she could infer it from the brain's structural integrity. The hippocampus, the amygdala, the prefrontal circuits involved in long-term memory storage, all were present, all were undamaged, all showed the normal synaptic density of a healthy adult brain. If his memories had been destroyed, there would be structural evidence of that destruction. There was none. He remembered. Whatever he had been, whoever he had been before the screamers took him, the pattern of that person was still inscribed in the neural architecture of his brain, preserved by dragon tissue in a dead man's grave on a frozen world, waiting to be read like a book that had been checked out of the library and returned in perfect condition after everyone had given up hope of ever seeing it again. Perk sat in the medical bay and stared at the scan results on her handheld terminal and felt something happening inside her that was not a thought and not an emotion and not a physical sensation, but was some combination of all three that her mind, trained to categorize and analyze, could not file into any existing folder. It was too big. It was too small. It was a baby dragon on a dead world and a man with a scarred hand and a heartbeat that should not have existed. And it was the most important thing that had ever happened in the history of her profession. And she could not think about it directly because thinking about it directly was like looking at the sun. You could feel the warmth, but you could not focus on the source. So she focused on the data instead. The numbers, the readings, the concrete, measurable, categorizable outputs of her equipment. She focused on them because they were solid and the thing behind them was not, and because she was a scientist and scientists dealt in evidence and evidence was what she had, even if the evidence was impossible. She ran the scans again, the results were the same. She ran them a third time, the same. She stopped running them and accepted, with a resignation that was not defeat but something closer to surrender, that the data was not going to change to fit her expectations. Her expectations were going to have to change to fit the data. Marcus Webb slept for 18 hours. Not the shallow, intermittent sleep of a recovering patient, the deep, immersive, total sleep of a body that was rebuilding itself from the inside out. His breathing was slow and even. His heartbeat held its strange, hybrid rhythm without variation. His body temperature gradually declined from 39.2 to 37.4, approaching the human baseline with the steady patience of a system finding its equilibrium. Asha slept beside him. She had not eaten since arriving on Kale 7. She had not eaten in the 3 weeks of the drone transit. She had been underfeeding for months before that. By any rational calculation, she should have been dead, not dying, not declining but dead, her body exhausted past the point of recovery, her reserves depleted to zero. But she was not dead. She was asleep, curled against Webb's side, her small body rising and falling with his breath. And when Perk placed a nutrient packet near her nose, not pushing, not forcing, just placing, Asha's mouth opened in her sleep, and she consumed the packet without waking, her jaws working automatically, her throat swallowing, her body accepting the fuel it needed with the unthinking efficiency of a machine refueling. She ate 4 packets in her sleep. Perk placed each one at her nose and watched it disappear and placed the next one and watched it disappear, and with each packet something in Asha's body changed, a subtle shift in the quality of her stillness, a relaxation of the tension that had been in her frame since the moment she hatched, a softening that was not physical but was visible nonetheless, like watching a knot that had been tied for a very long time slowly come undone. On the 14th hour of Webb's sleep, Asha woke up. She lifted her head and looked around the medical bay with eyes that were different. Not physically different, they were the same dark, too large eyes they had always been, set in the same small gray face. But the quality of attention behind them had changed. The frantic, desperate focus that had driven every action she had taken since hatching, the single-minded pursuit of the heartbeat, the escape, the journey, the digging, the holding on, was gone. In its place was something quieter. Something that had room in it for more than one thing. She looked at Perku. This was the first time in Asha's life that she had voluntarily made eye contact with a human who was not Marcus Webb. Perk knew this. She had been present for every interaction Asha had had with every human since hatching, and not once in 4 months, had Asha looked at any of them the way she was looking at Perk now. It was not love, it was not gratitude. It was not any of the emotionally loaded terms that Perk would have been tempted to use if she were writing for a popular audience rather than a scientific journal. It was acknowledgement. Asha saw Perk. She registered her presence, recognized her as an individual, and allocated a portion of her attention to the act of maintaining that recognition. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. It was the dragon equivalent of a person who had been locked in a dark room for their entire life suddenly turning their head to look at a window, not because they understood what a window was, but because they had noticed that the quality of the darkness had changed. Asha looked at Perk for 3 seconds. Then she looked back at Webb, pressed her nose against his throat, and closed her eyes. But she did not growl, she did not hiss. She did not make any sound of rejection or hostility. She had simply decided, in whatever way dragons made decisions, that Perk was not a threat. For the first time in her life, Asha had let someone in who was not him. Webb woke on the 18th hour. He woke the way a person wakes from a very deep sleep, slowly in stages, with long intervals of semi-consciousness between the initial return of awareness and the full resumption of function. His eyes opened first, unfocused, staring at the shuttle's ceiling without recognition. His fingers moved next, curling and uncurling against the thermal blanket, testing the texture, confirming that the thing they were touching was real. His breathing changed, deepened, quickened slightly, shifted from the automatic rhythm of sleep to the deliberate rhythm of wakefulness. His swallow reflex engaged, his Adam's apple bobbing, and Perk heard him make a sound that was not a word but was the precursor to a word, a sound that meant my mouth is dry and I need water and I am going to try to communicate this, but I am not sure I remember how communication works. Perk gave him water. She held the cup to his lips, a standard-issue hydration vessel, room temperature, filtered water that tasted faintly of the recycling system's mineral additives. and he drank from it with small, careful sips, his throat working, his eyes closing again as the water went down. Asha lifted her head and watched him drink, and she made the humming sound, low, soft, approving, and Webb's hand found her back without him looking, his fingers settling into the grooves between her scales with a precision that suggested muscle memory from a pattern he had never consciously formed. "Where am I?" he said. His voice was better than it had been at the grave. Still rough, still damaged, still the voice of a man whose vocal cords had been on an extended vacation, but capable of forming words now, capable of the basic mechanics of speech. The words came out slowly, each one separated from the next by a pause, as if he was sorting through a filing cabinet that had been dropped and was reassembling it page by page. "On a shuttle," Perk said, "in orbit above KL7, we brought you up from the surface about 18 hours ago." Webb processed this. She could see him processing it, the slight movement of his eyes, the micro-expressions that crossed his face as each piece of information found its place in the rebuilding architecture of his understanding. He was not confused. That was the remarkable thing. He was not disoriented, not panicked, not demanding explanations with the urgency of a person who has been ripped from one reality and thrust into another. He was calm, with a calmness that was not the absence of reaction, but the presence of something deeper. A fundamental bedrock certainty that whatever had happened, whatever was happening, he was where he needed to be. "Asha," he said, not a question, a statement, a confirmation. His hand pressed slightly against her back and she pressed back, and the circuit that had been closed at the grave was maintained. "She's right here," Perk said. "She hasn't left your side." Webb's eyes moved, found Perk, looked at her, really looked at her, with the same quality of focused attention that Asha had shown earlier, but deeper, because Webb had decades of practice at looking at people, and Perk was a person who was worth looking at. His eyes were brown, slightly cast to the left, and they were the eyes of a man who had seen something in the dark that had changed him in ways that he had not yet found words for. "I remember the door," he said. Perk waited. "I remember holding the door, I remember the screaming, I remember pushing the egg through." His hand moved on Asha's back, a slow stroke, the kind of repetitive motion that a person makes when they are grounding themselves in physical sensation to keep from being pulled under by memory. "I remember pain, a lot of pain, and then nothing, like falling asleep, like being in a room and someone turning off the lights, not gradual, instant. One moment I was there and the next moment I wasn't." He paused, his eyes moved to the ceiling. "But I wasn't nowhere," he said. "I was somewhere, I just couldn't see it or feel it, or it was like being in a room with the lights off. You know the room is there, you can feel the walls if you reach out, but you can't see anything, and there was a sound." His hand stopped moving on Asha's back. "A heartbeat," he said, "not mine, someone else's, or not someone else's, not exactly. It was like mine but not mine, like my heartbeat had been copied and the copy was playing on a speaker in another room, and it was constant, it never stopped. For I don't know how long, time doesn't work the same way when you can't see anything. It could have been minutes or years or centuries, but the heartbeat was always there, always, and then." He stopped, his fingers curled into Asha's fur, not fur scales, but his fingers treated them the same way, curling into the texture, holding on. And then something changed. The heartbeat got closer, or I got closer to it, or the room got smaller, something changed, and there was a voice. "A voice," Perk said. "Not words, not language, it was more like intent. Like someone was thinking at me and I could feel the shape of what they were thinking even though I couldn't hear the words. And the shape was," he stopped again. His jaw tightened. His eyes brightened with a moisture that he blinked away before it could fall. "The shape was come back," he said, over and over. "Come back, come back, come back, like a child pulling on your hand. Like a small, stubborn hand pulling on your hand and saying, 'Come back, you're not done, come back.'" He looked at Asha, she was looking at him. Their faces were inches apart, and the expression on her face, the ancient, too-old expression in her too large eyes, was the same expression that Perk had seen on the stone marker in the rain, the expression that was not a dragon expression but a human expression. The expression of something that had been alone for too long and had refused to accept that aloneness was permanent. "A dragon told me to wake up," Webb said, "so I woke up." He recovered fully within a week. This was, by any medical standard, impossible. A human body that had been dead for 3 years, even a body that had been preserved by some unknown biological mechanism, should not have been able to resume normal function within 7 days. The muscles should have atrophied beyond recovery. The joints should have stiffened to the point of immobility. The digestive system should have shut down. The endocrine system should have been thrown into catastrophic dysregulation. There should have been organ damage, neurological deficits, immune system collapse, and a dozen other cascading failures that would have required months of intensive medical intervention to address, if they could be addressed at all. None of this happened. Webb's body recovered with a speed and completeness that suggested it had not been recovering at all but completing, as if the 3 years in the membrane had not been a pause in his development but a continuation of it. a slow, directed process of reconstruction that had been ongoing the entire time he was underground, and that had simply reached a point where external support was no longer needed. His muscles regained their strength within 3 days. His joints loosened within 4. His digestive system came online on day 2, when he sat up in the medical bay bed and asked for food with the flat, unemotional directness of a man who had not eaten in 3 years and was not interested in discussing the implications. He ate the shuttle's standard rations, nutrient paste, protein bars, rehydrated vegetables that tasted like wet cardboard and had the texture to match. He ate without complaint, without enthusiasm, without any apparent emotional response to the act of eating at all. It was fuel. He needed fuel. He consumed fuel. The simplicity of it was almost meditative to watch. His body temperature normalized by day 3, settling at 37 degrees, 0.1 below the standard baseline, close enough to be unremarkable. The bioluminescence continued to fade, the blue vein patterns on his skin dimming by the hour until, by the end of the first week, the only remaining trace was on his forearms, 2 thin lines, one on each arm following the path of the radial artery that glowed so faintly that they were visible only in complete darkness, and even then only if you knew where to look. They did not fade further. They reached a certain level of faintness and stopped, as if they had found their equilibrium, and they stayed there, permanent, invisible in daylight, ghostly in the dark, a reminder of what had been done and what could not be entirely undone. Asha stayed on his shoulder. She rode there during his walks through the shuttle's narrow corridors, his physical therapy, the slow rebuilding of muscle memory and proprioception that his body demanded even though, by all evidence, it did not actually need it. She perched on his shoulder with her tail wrapped around his collar and her claws hooked into the fabric of his jumpsuit, a new jumpsuit, borrowed from the shuttle's emergency stores, because his original clothes had been on his body when he died and had not survived the 3 years, and she watched the world go by with eyes that were no longer desperate. She was still quiet, still reserved, still not the kind of dragon that would seek out human attention or accept affection from strangers, but the hostility was gone. The wall of rejection that she had maintained for 4 months on Omega-9, the hissing, the biting, the contemptuous refusal to engage, had been replaced by something that was not exactly warmth but was its distant cousin, a willingness to tolerate, a lack of active objection, a neutrality that was, given her history, practically gregarious. She let Perk approach. She let Perk touch her briefly, carefully, a single stroke along her spine that Perk performed with the reverence of a person handling a sacred object. She did not enjoy it. She did not dislike it. She allowed it, and the allowing was a gift that Perk did not take for granted. She let Brennan near. She let Rivas near, though she watched Rivas with a suspicious intensity that Perk suspected had less to do with any specific threat Rivas posed and more to do with a general dragon skepticism toward loud people. She did not let anyone else near Webb. This was non-negotiable. If anyone other than Perk, Brennan, or Rivas approached Webb within arm's length, Asha's lips peeled back from her teeth and a sound came out of her throat that was not a growl but was the precursor to one. A warning that said you are close to the line, and the line is where I say it is, and if you cross it you will learn things about dragon teeth that you did not know before. People gave Webb space. The shuttle returned to Omega-9 on the 7th day. The reception was not what Perk had expected. She had expected or feared or hoped for, depending on which part of her was doing the expecting, a storm of attention. Scientists, military personnel, administrators, journalists, the entire apparatus of the station's bureaucratic machinery descending on the Corax the moment it docked, demanding answers, demanding access, demanding to know how a dead man had come back to life on a screamer-contaminated world because of a baby dragon. What she got was Commander HSU, standing alone in the docking bay, with a face that had aged 10 years in the week since she had left. The reports had arrived before her. Not her reports, she had been too busy to file anything comprehensive, but the station's automated monitoring systems, which had tracked the Corax's telemetry and had recorded the biosign data from the shuttle's medical bay and had flagged the results for immediate review by the station's medical staff. The medical staff had reviewed the results and had escalated them to the commander. The commander had looked at the results and had made a decision. The decision was silence. No public announcement, no press conference, no scientific review panel, no military debriefing. The information was to be classified at the highest level available under coalition protocols, shared only with the specific individuals who had a direct need to know, and even those individuals were to be told only what they needed to know and nothing more. The reason for the silence was not bureaucratic. It was not political. It was not even strategic, though HSU would later frame it in strategic terms when he was asked to justify his decision by the review board that eventually investigated it. The reason was fear. Not fear of dragons, not fear of the screamers, not fear of any external threat that could be named and categorized and allocated a threat assessment rating. Fear of what people would do with the information. Because if dragons could bring the dead back to life, if a baby dragon, alone and unaided, could reverse death itself through sheer instinct and will, then every government, every corporation, every military organization, every desperate family with a dead loved one in a cold vault somewhere would want one. They would breed them. They would harvest them. They would study them and quantify them and turn them into technology, into medicine, into weapons, into commodities. They would do what humans always did with things that were powerful and incomprehensible and wild. They would try to own them. And dragons could not be owned. This was not a philosophical statement. It was an observed fact, documented across every world where dragons had been found, in every study ever conducted on the species. Dragons did not respond to coercion. They did not respond to incentive structures. They did not form bonds with individuals or institutions. They formed bonds with people, specific individuals, and the bond was either present or it was not. And no amount of training or conditioning could create it where it did not naturally exist. If the military tried to use dragons to revive dead soldiers, they would fail. The dragon would not cooperate because the dragon would not have bonded with the soldier, and without the bond, there was no revival. The bond was not a tool. It was not a mechanism. It was not something that could be engineered or directed or controlled. It was love. And love, as every human civilization had eventually discovered, could not be weaponized. HSU understood this. PERC understood this. The handful of people on Omega-9 who were read into the classified file understood this. They also understood that not everyone would understand this, and that the people who did not understand it would do enormous damage trying to make it work, and that by the time they failed, and they would fail, because love could not be weaponized, the damage to the dragon population would be irreversible. So the silence, not forever, not permanently, but until the science was better understood, until the parameters were clearer, until there was enough data to build a case for protection that even the most determined bureaucrat could not argue with. HSU met them at the docking bay and shook Webb's hand and looked at a Shao on Webb's shoulder and said nothing about the scale patterns on Webb's forearms. He assigned Webb to a private quarters suite on the station's residential deck. He assigned Perk as Webb's primary medical liaison. He assigned Brennan and Rivas to a discreet security detail with orders to prevent unauthorized access and to report any approaches from military intelligence personnel immediately. He did not ask Webb what it was like to be dead. He did not ask Perk for a scientific explanation. He did not ask Asha anything at all. He simply said, "Take your time, let me know what you need." And then he left, and Webb was alone on a space station for the first time in his life, with a dragon on his shoulder and a story that the galaxy was not ready to hear. In the months that followed, 7 more cases of dragon-assisted revival were documented across settled space. Not immediately. The first case after Webb did not occur for 11 months, and it happened not because anyone was looking for it, but because a researcher on a remote agricultural colony happened to notice that a dragon who had been bonded to a colonist who had died in an equipment accident had been spending an unusual amount of time at the colonist's gravesite. The researcher investigated, partly out of scientific curiosity and partly because the dragon's behavior was disrupting the colony's memorial garden, and found the same membrane, the same cocoon, the same heartbeat beneath the stone. The second case occurred 3 months after that on a military outpost near the Vannies corridor. A soldier had been killed in a border skirmish. Her dragon, a mature adult, not a hatchling, the first adult case documented, had remained at the outpost after the body was buried and had refused all attempts at relocation. When the ground above the grave began to show the characteristic vein-like fractures, the outpost's medical officer, who had been briefed on the classified KL-7 file through a chain of command that technically should not have existed, recognized the signs and initiated containment protocols. The cases were different in their details but identical in their essentials. Each involved a dragon that had bonded with a human. Each required the dragon to be present at or near the site of death. The physical proximity was non-negotiable. The bond could not reach across distances. The dragon had to be there. Each took years. The shortest documented case was 18 months. The longest was 4 years and still ongoing. Each produced the membrane, the cocoon, the hybrid vascular integration. Each left the revived human with faint scale patterns somewhere on their body, always on the forearms, always following the path of the radial artery, as if that particular vessel was the interface point where dragon biology and human biology could most easily merge. And each required love. Not affection, not attachment, not the mild positive regard that a person might feel for a coworker or a neighbor or a friend. Love, the specific, overwhelming, identity-level love that a dragon formed with its bonded person, the love that was not an emotion but a state of being, the love that restructured the dragon's entire nervous system around the presence of one specific individual and could not be transferred or redirected or applied to anyone else. The military tried anyway. Of course they tried. The classified files on Dragon Revival had been leaked within 6 months of the first post-web case. Perk had predicted this, HSU had predicted this, everyone who understood how information flowed through military bureaucracies had predicted this, and the response was exactly what Perk had feared. A program was established. Dragons were acquired, bred, purchased, in some cases taken from wild populations on frontier worlds where the coalition's regulatory reach was thin. Dead soldiers were selected, casualties from ongoing conflicts, bodies preserved in cold storage, families who had been told their loved ones were gone and who were now being told that maybe, possibly, there was a chance. The dragons refused to cooperate. Not violently, not dramatically. They simply did not. They sat in the containment units the military built for them and stared at the walls and did not produce membranes, did not generate cocoons, did not do any of the things that the program's directors had expected them to do. Some of them stopped eating. 2 of them died not from mistreatment, not from neglect, but from something that the veterinary staff could only describe as giving up, a cessation of the will to live that was not accompanied by any identifiable physiological cause. The program was shut down after 14 months. An official report was filed that cited insufficient compatibility between bonded dragon subjects and designated revival targets, and recommended further study before attempting additional interventions. The unofficial report, written by the program's chief medical officer and circulated privately among a small network of xenobiologists and military ethicists, was more honest. It said, "Dragons cannot be ordered to love. Love is not a procedure, it is not a protocol. It is not something that can be induced by proximity or conditioning or any technique currently available to human science. The dragon either loves the person or it does not, and if it does not, no revival is possible." We spent 14 months and the equivalent of 3 colony ships worth of resources trying to make this work. And the only thing we proved is that love, in the dragon sense, is not a variable we can control. The report was classified, it would remain classified for decades. But every human who had ever been loved by a dragon already knew what it said. They did not need a military report to tell them. They knew because they had felt it, the specific, irreplaceable, non-transferable quality of a dragon's attention, the way a dragon looked at you and not at anyone else. The way a dragon's presence in your life felt like a door opening onto a room that had always existed, but that you had never been able to find on your own. They knew because they had been on the other end of it, and they knew that what they had been given was not a tool or a resource or a capability. It was a gift, unearned, undeserved, impossible to replicate, and therefore, in the deepest and most practical sense, priceless. Marcus Webb lived on Omega 9 for 3 years after his return. He did not become famous. The classification of his case saw to that the broader public never learned his name, never saw his face, never knew that a maintenance technician from a dead colony had been brought back to life by a baby dragon who had crossed an ocean of empty space to lie on his grave and refuse to let go. He was, in the eyes of the station's population, a quiet man who lived in a private quarters suite with a small gray dragon on his shoulder, and who kept to himself, and who occasionally visited the medical wing for checkups that nobody else knew the purpose of. He was happy. This was the thing that surprised Perk the most, not that he was alive, not that he was healthy, but that he was happy. She had expected trauma. She had expected PTSD, depression, existential crisis, the psychological fallout of dying and being dead and coming back, the weight of 3 years of nothing, the disorientation of returning to a world that had moved on without him. She had prepared for all of it, had assembled a team of counselors and therapists who had been cleared for the classified file and who were standing by to provide whatever support Webb needed. He did not need it. Not because he was repressing, not because he was in denial. Perk ran the psychological assessments herself and the results were consistent and clear. Marcus Webb was not traumatized by his experience. He was not unaffected by it. His affect had changed subtly in ways that a less careful observer might have missed. He was quieter than he had been before, though this was difficult to quantify because he had been quiet to begin with. He was more present, more here, in the moment, in the room, in the conversation, as if the experience of being absent for 3 years had given him an appreciation for presence that he had lacked before. He laughed more easily, though his laugh was still quiet, still the laugh of a man who did not need to be loud to be heard. And he was kind. He had always been kind. Perk had learned this from the interviews she conducted with the Kale 7 survivors who had known him, the 42 people who had been on the Kestrel and who had watched him die through a closing door. They all said the same things about him. He was reliable, he was good, he was there. He was the kind of person who showed up. But the kindness he displayed after his return was different from the kindness he had shown before. Before, his kindness had been passive, a quality of his presence rather than an action he took. He was kind the way a warm room is warm, you entered it and felt better and did not necessarily think about why. After, his kindness was active. He looked at people. He really looked at them with those brown, slightly cast eyes that had seen something in the dark and had come back different, and he saw them. And they knew they were being seen, and it mattered to them in ways that they could not always articulate. He visited the memorial that Omega-9 had established for the KL-7 colonists. 570 names carved into a wall in the station's central atrium, illuminated by soft white light. He stood in front of the wall for a long time, a sha on his shoulder, and he read the names, all of them, every one, and he did not cry. But something moved in his face that was deeper than crying. A shifting of the geological layers of expression that underlay the surface features that most people showed the world. He found the names of the people who had dug his grave. Henriksen, Abadi. He stood in front of their names and was quiet for a long time, and then he said very softly, "Thank you." Asha pressed her nose against his cheek. The interview happened on the second anniversary of his return. It was not a public interview. It was part of the classified archive, recorded for the historical record, intended for future researchers who would eventually, when the classification was lifted, need primary source material to understand what had happened on KL-7 and in the years that followed. The interviewer was a historian named Dr. Yuki Chen, who had been cleared for the file, and who had spent 6 months preparing questions that she hoped would elicit responses that went beyond the clinical data in the medical reports. She asked him about the science. She asked about the membrane, the cocoon, the experience of being inside it. She asked about the heartbeat he had heard, the voice that had called him back the moment of waking. He answered all of her questions with the same quiet directness that characterized everything he did, no embellishment, no drama, no attempt to make the experience more than it was or less than it was. He told her what he remembered. He told her when he did not remember. He told her when he was unsure whether what he remembered was real, or a construction of his mind trying to fill in the gaps. Then she asked him the question she had been saving for the end. "Mr. Webb, in your assessment, what is the most important thing about what happened to you?" He was quiet for a long time. Asha was on his shoulder, her eyes half closed, her body warm against his neck. His hand was resting on her back, his thumb moving in a slow, absent pattern that he probably was not aware of. "Humans like to think we're the ones who protect things," he said. "We build the walls, we hold the doors, we make the sacrifices. We write the stories about the brave humans who did the brave thing, and we put ourselves at the center of every narrative because we're the ones telling the stories, and that's what we do. We put ourselves at the center." He paused, his thumb moved on Asha's back. "But sometimes something decides to protect us back. And we don't get to choose what form it takes. We don't get to choose how small it is. We don't get to choose whether it makes sense. We don't get to choose any of it. It just happens, and what happens is bigger than us, and all we can do is accept it and be grateful and try to be worth it." He reached up and scratched Asha under her chin. She closed her eyes and made a sound like a purr, a low, rumbling vibration that Chen could feel through the floor of the interview room, that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the small gray body on Webb's shoulder, that carried in it a weight of 3 years of refusal to let go and the relief of finally being able to rest. "She was a baby," Webb said. "She was a baby on a planet where everything was dead, and she was alone, and she was scared, and she had no reason to think that what she was doing would work. She didn't have a plan, she didn't have a theory, she didn't have science or technology or any of the things that humans use to solve problems. She just had herself and whatever was inside her, and she used it, and she didn't stop, and she brought me back." His voice did not break. It did not waver. It was the same steady, unhurried voice it had always been, the voice of a man who did not need to be loud to be heard, who had never needed to be loud, who had held a door shut with his body and said 2 words through a gap too small for his fingers and changed the course of a life that had not yet been born. "She was a baby," he said again, "and she was braver than I ever was." Asha lived for 97 years. This was not extraordinary by dragon standards. The species was long-lived, with documented lifespans ranging from 80 to over 200 years depending on the individual and the environment. But it was extraordinary for a dragon who had spent the first 4 months of her life starving herself on a space station, and the next 3 weeks in the cargo bay of an unheated drone, and the 2 weeks after that lying on a frozen grave while she poured herself into the ground like water into dry earth. She should not have lived that long. The early deprivation should have shortened her lifespan. The cocoon, which had been grown from her own biological substance, draining her reserves to a point that should have been fatal, should have killed her. By every model that xenobiologists had for dragon development and longevity, Asha should have been the shortest-lived dragon on record. She was not. She lived and she thrived and she grew slowly at first, then more rapidly as the years passed and her body recovered from the deprivations of her infancy. Her scales hardened from wet ash to a deeper gray, almost blue in certain lights, with a subtle iridescence that appeared and disappeared depending on the angle of observation. Her wings unfolded to their full span, impressive for a dragon of her size, which was never large by the standards of her species but was perfectly proportioned. Every angle and curve exactly right, as if her body had been designed by someone who understood that beauty was not about size or grandeur, but about the precise relationship between parts. She stayed with Webb. Not constantly, as she matured, she began to spend time away from him, exploring the station, socializing in her reserved, selective way with other dragons that were brought to Omega-9 for study or companionship. She never bonded with another human. She tolerated humans the way a cat tolerates the other people in its household, acknowledging their presence, accepting their proximity, occasionally allowing a touch, but saving the full depth of her attention for the one person who had earned it. Webb died at the age of 81. Natural causes. Heart failure, his own heart, not the hybrid organ that the cocoon had built, which had gradually been replaced by normal cardiac tissue over the course of 2 decades until nothing remained of the dragon modification except the faint glowing lines on his forearms that had never fully faded. His heart, when it stopped, was entirely human. Asha was with him. She was on the bed, curled against his side, her head on his chest, her eyes closed. She felt the heartbeat slow, she felt it stutter, she felt it stop. She did not try to bring him back. This was the thing that Perk, who was present, who had been present for every significant moment of Asha's life, and who was not going to miss this one, found most remarkable about Webb's death. Asha had the ability. She was a mature dragon, fully grown, her biological capabilities at their peak. If any dragon could have reversed a death, it was Asha. She did not try. She lay on his chest and she keened, the same keening that Perk had heard on Kale 7, the same questioning, desperate sound, but different now, older, deeper, carrying a weight that the hatchling's version had not possessed because the hatchling had not yet known what it felt like to lose the thing she was keening for. She keened for a long time. Hours. The sound filled the room and filled the corridor outside and filled the station in a way that was not physical, but was nonetheless real. A resonance that every person on Omega-9 felt in some small, unnameable part of themselves. A reminder of something they had lost or would lose or were afraid of losing. And then she stopped. She lifted her head. She looked at Perk with eyes that were ancient and young and full of something that Perk, after 30 years of studying dragons, still did not have a word for. And then she stood up, walked to the window of Webb's quarters and looked out at the stars. She did not look back at the bed. She did not look at Webb's body. She looked at the stars and her face was still and she was quiet, and the thing that she was feeling was not grief and not peace and not acceptance, but was something that contained elements of all three and was larger than any of them. She had held on for 97 years. She had brought him back once. She was not going to do it again. Not because she could not. Not because she did not want to. Because she understood, in whatever way dragons understood things, with whatever faculty they used to navigate a universe that did not follow rules, that some things were not meant to be reversed. That the cycle had a shape, and the shape included endings. And that love was not the refusal to let go, but the willingness to hold on for exactly as long as holding on was the right thing to do, and then to open your hands and let what you were holding return to wherever it had come from. Marcus Webb had lived 81 years. He had held a door shut. He had carried an egg. He had come back from the dead. He had been kind and present and quietly, stubbornly good in a galaxy that did not always reward those qualities, but that was better for having them in it. It was enough. Ashan knew it was enough. And in the years that followed, the long, quiet years of a dragon who had outlived the person she loved and who chose to keep living anyway, not because she had to, but because the universe was large and there were things in it worth seeing and she had not seen all of them yet. She carried that knowledge with her the way she had carried his heartbeat in the dark, closely, completely, and without letting go. Not anymore. In the years that followed Webb's death, the classification on the Dragon Revival files was gradually relaxed. Not lifted, the information was still restricted, still controlled, still shielded from the public eye by layers of bureaucratic protection that served a purpose even if the purpose was no longer as urgent as it had once been. But relaxed, shared with a wider circle of researchers. Discussed at conferences that were not officially about Dragon Revival, but that had Dragon Revival on the agenda under euphemistic headings like anomalous biological recovery processes in bonded dragon-human pairs. The science advanced. Slowly, carefully, with the caution that the subject demanded. Researchers mapped the process in detail, the membrane formation, the vascular integration, the neural preservation, the gradual reconstruction of the body from the pattern that the dragon held in its bond imprint. They developed theoretical models that explained how it worked without explaining why it worked, which was the characteristic limitation of every scientific theory about dragons. The models could describe the mechanism but could not account for the motive force, the thing that made the mechanism run, the will that turned biology into something that was not quite biology and was not quite magic, and was not quite anything that human language had a word for. Perk published her definitive paper on the subject when she was 63 years old. It was 340 pages long. It contained every piece of data she had gathered over 4 decades of study: the scans, the recordings, the behavioral observations, the biochemical analyses, the theoretical frameworks, the failed hypotheses, the dead ends, the moments of wonder that she had recorded in her field notes with a precision that was scientific in its methodology but poetic in its effect. It was, by universal consensus, the most important paper in the history of xenobiology. Its conclusion was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph summarized the findings. Dragon-assisted revival was possible, required a bond of sufficient depth between dragon and human, took between 18 months and 4 years, and produced a revived individual with no significant physical or neurological deficits. The second paragraph discussed the limitations. The bond could not be artificially induced, the process could not be accelerated or controlled, and the dragon's willingness to attempt revival appeared to be a personal choice rather than an instinctual imperative, as demonstrated by Ashaz's decision not to revive Webb a second time. The third paragraph was different from anything else in the paper. It was not data, it was not analysis, it was not theory. It was a statement, simple, direct, unadorned, that Perk had spent 40 years arriving at and that she knew with the certainty of a person who has spent her life looking at something from every possible angle was the truest thing she would ever write. The galaxy's greatest scientists cannot explain what happened on KL7, but every human who has ever been loved by a dragon understands it perfectly. Some things do not require explanation. They only require the kind of stubbornness that looks small from the outside and is, on the inside, larger than death itself. The paper was cited 12,000 times in the first decade after publication. The third paragraph was cited more often than any other section, not because it contained data but because it contained truth, and truth, in any field of study, was the thing that lasted longest. Ashaz died on a Tuesday. She was 97 years old. She died in the observation deck of Omega 9, the one that looked out toward Kale 7, the one where she had spent the last 10 years of her life sitting on a heated perch that the station's engineering crew had built for her after she developed a preference for that particular view. She died quietly in her sleep the way old dragons died, a gradual slowing, a gentle diminishing, a cessation of the force that had animated her for nearly a century. Perk was with her. She had been with Ashaz for almost the dragon's entire life. 53 years of mornings and evenings and quiet afternoons in the observation deck, of scan sessions and feeding schedules and the slow, patient work of building a relationship with a creature who had given her love to someone else and had only the leftovers to offer. And Perk had taken the leftovers and had been grateful for them because even the leftovers of a dragon's love were more than most people ever received. She held Ashaz as she died. The dragon was small in her arms. She had always been small for her species, and age had reduced her further, her scales thin and pale, her wings folded tight against her body, her eyes closed. She weighed almost nothing. She felt like a bundle of dry leaves, like something that had given away so much of itself over the course of a long life that there was barely anything left to hold. But she was warm. Even in death, she was warm, that dragon warmth, that impossible, unscientific warmth that had nothing to do with metabolism and everything to do with what she was. The thing that humans could detect but not explain, the thing that made being near a dragon feel like being near a fire that did not burn. Perk held her and cried. Not the professional, controlled tears of a scientist confronting the loss of a research subject, but the deep, ugly, uncontrolled crying of a woman who had loved something and lost it and who understood in that moment, with a clarity that she had spent her entire career circling, that the loss was not a scientific event. It was a human event. It was the event that humans had been having since the first human loved the first thing that could not stay, and it did not matter that the thing was a dragon, because the shape of the grief was the same. She held Ashaz and looked out the observation deck window at the stars, and somewhere out there, beyond the reach of any telescope, was a frozen planet with a cemetery and a cracked stone marker with a misspelled name. And under that marker was an empty grave because the man who had been buried there was not there anymore, because a baby dragon had decided that he was not done yet, and the universe had listened. The universe had listened. That was the thing that Perk could not explain. Not the biology, not the mechanism, not the theoretical models that her colleagues were still refining and arguing about. The thing she could not explain was the simplest thing of all, that the universe had listened. that a baby dragon had asked for something impossible, and the universe, which was vast and cold and indifferent, and had no reason to care about the desires of a creature the size of a hunting dog on a planet at the edge of nowhere, had said yes. Why? Perk did not know. She had spent her whole life not knowing, and she had made peace with not knowing, because some questions were not meant to be answered but to be lived with, and living with this question, why does the universe say yes to some things and no to others, and what makes a baby dragon's refusal to let go powerful enough to change the answer, had been in the end the most meaningful question of her life. She laid a Sha down on the heated perch. She arranged her body in the curled position that a Sha had always slept in, nose under tail, body flat, oriented toward the starboard side, toward Kale 7, toward the grave that was empty now but that had not been empty when it mattered. She looked at the small gray form on the perch. She looked at the stars beyond the window. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had held a door shut and pushed an egg through a closing gap and died in the cold with a scar on his knuckle and a misspelled name on his stone. She thought about a baby dragon who had crossed an ocean of nothing to lie on that stone and sing to the darkness underneath it. She thought about a heartbeat that had stopped and started again, and a light that had poured out of the ground, and a man who had surfaced from his own grave and said, "I think I've been asleep." She thought about love, the human kind and the dragon kind, the kind that holds doors and the kind that holds on, the kind that is loud and the kind that is quiet, the kind that looks like sacrifice and the kind that looks like a small gray creature lying on a stone in the rain, refusing to move, refusing to stop, refusing to accept that the thing she loved was gone. Some things do not require explanation. They only require the kind of stubbornness that looks small from the outside and is, on the inside, larger than death itself. Perk turned off the light in the observation deck. She left a Sha to the stars and the silence and the long view toward a frozen planet where a grave was empty and a stone was cracked and the memory of a heartbeat was fading slowly, into the cold indifference of a world that had never wanted anyone there and that had been forced for a little while to care. She walked back to her quarters, she closed the door, she sat in the dark. And somewhere, in the space between the stars where the rules were different and the stubborn had a power that the rational could not explain, a small gray dragon sang a song to a man who was not there anymore. And the song was not sad, and the song was not happy, and the song was not anything that could be named. It was just love. And that was enough. It had always been enough.